Tales for Dark Nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Our first tale tonight comes to us from author Jacob Senstad, The Drowning Experiment. It's not on record as The Drowning Experiment. The official name is AQ521-G4, but I've chosen to call it what it truly was. It was marketed as an opportunity for people with previous experience in aquatic settings to earn high positions for coastal work, aquamarine research, and other well-paying jobs. The premise was simple. Prove you can handle endurance tests in water, pass a psychological evaluation, and some tests for intelligence, and the jobs will open up. As an unemployed 25-year-old guy living with his parents, well, this seemed to be promising opportunity. I grew up along the coast where swimming, surfing, and scuba diving on occasion were pastimes I had learned to love. I called the number on the listing and set up my appointment. The nearest facility was only 60 miles from my house, and an hour commute didn't bother me. The area was nice enough that I would have been more than happy to find a place to rent and start working there. I parked my rusted Jeep in the parking lot and took in a breath of the fresh ocean air. It was bitter, but even winters in California are still warm enough for me. I scanned the cars in the parking lot as if to measure up the competition. Several old vehicles on the brink of breaking down were parked around me. Along the west side of the building was a fleet of very nice-looking SUVs. I peeked inside of the nearest one, thinking I might get a company vehicle like that if I landed a nice enough job. I walked into the front door and was greeted by metal detectors and a guard. I removed my cell phone and wallet and proceeded to a woman standing behind a rather sturdy sheet of glass, similar to what you'd see in a bank. She took my information and had me take a seat in the waiting area. I let my mind wander as I surveyed the group of people populating the area. People of all ages were waiting eagerly for the chance to make plenty of bank. I sat next to a 39-year-old guy named Eric. He told me about his wife and 2 children. His oldest daughter was going to college next year, and he needed the money to put her through college. He was a great guy and spoke elegantly about his love for both his wife and his daughters. A young girl across from us, named Chloe, chimed in about how she was a sophomore in college, about 20 minutes from the facility. She wanted to find a job during college so she wouldn't end up unemployed after graduation. I wish I was as smart as her when I was at that age. A man walked in and escorted the group back into a pristine room filled with very expensive-looking machinery. Polished stainless steel equipment occupied the spotless room. The group, maybe 13 in total, all gave the same impressed look while they let their eyes dance from corner to corner. "Well, I'm glad to see such a nice turnout," he said. "We're going to start in our new ocean simulator we had just installed." We walked through a set of double doors to see a giant indoor pool. It must have been at least 50 feet wide and long. It was intimidating, but I'd adopted a false hope that I was in good hands. "This is 20 feet deep," the man said. "Nothing compared to the ocean just behind us, but it's plenty deep for our first test." It all started off mundane. We swam to the middle of the pool with the task to tread water for 15 minutes. Nobody wavered, but worse was to come. The man pointed toward the east side of the pool, where a man standing behind a table full of equipment gave him a nod. Within 2 seconds, 2 large pieces of equipment on opposite sides of the pool began vibrating up and down. Gentle waves began crashing into us as we continued to tread. Some of us were blown away by the engineering of the machinery. A few in the group stood out for their arrogance. They scoffed when the waves came in. We'd already been treading for 15 minutes. 10 minutes of waves, it hit us, and 2 people gave up during this test. They struggled to swim to the edge of the pool, but made it safely. "Is this all we're going to do?" a man in the group yelled out. The man who brought us in smiled and nodded toward the man at the table. He flipped a switch and the lights dimmed. We couldn't see the edges of the pool anymore, and we looked around to greet each other with the same scared expression. "Let her rip," the man said as machines whirred from all sides of the pool. Waves hit us from all directions as we thrashed around. Only a few minutes passed as I heard people behind me screaming so loudly it pierced my eardrums. "Someone help me! I recognized that voice. It was Chloe. I turned to see if I could help her, but it was too dark to see more than a few feet away. I heard screams and cries in every direction. It was a battlefield with no gunfire. The relentless waves hitting us from every path were clearly winning this war. I felt something swimming below me and assumed they slipped a few people to help the weak. The lights flipped on, the waves felt silent, and 6 of us remained. I looked around and locked eyes with Eric. I scanned the crowd, but Chloe was gone. I looked at my watch, but we were only in the chaos for 7 minutes, and it wiped out half the participants. The others had been escorted out of the building. The man conducting the test said, "Congratulations on passing. Dry off and we'll run further experiments after lunch." We walked into the parking lot where Eric offered to give me a ride to a nearby restaurant. "The fuck was that?" he asked as we sat down with our food. "No clue," I responded as I took a sip of my Diet Coke. We didn't speak much and didn't eat too much food, as we knew we'd be subjected to more punishment later that day. There was something somber yet powerful about our meal together. It was as if there was something special about us. In fact, we'd made it through the mayhem, but celebration wasn't in order. We arrived back at the facility and sat patiently in the waiting room again. The few of us that remained weren't excited. We were worried. Like me, I knew they were slim on other options and hoped a little bit of tough work would pay off in the long run. "Follow me. We're going on a field trip," the man said as he motioned us through the front doors. We followed towards a beautiful boat parked just past the parking lot. Loading in one by one, we rode along into the ocean. "There may be some scenarios where you'll find yourself stuck at ocean," he said. "Every job will know your general location, but it may take time for help to arrive. We've tested your ability to survive a storm, but endurance is also a necessity." We rowed until the coastline was hardly visible, and we were dumped into the ocean without life jackets and told to stay afloat. Whether it be paddling our feet or laying on our backs, stay afloat. "We will have you out here for 1 hour," he said. "You've got food in your stomachs, and we know where you are. We'll monitor you from a distance to make sure you're safe and can handle the task." "Make it 2," said a familiar voice. It was the same guy from the pool who wasn't impressed with the gentle waves. The man conducting the tests looked at him from the boat with a look of dissatisfaction. "If you would like a 2-hour test, could take the SAT," he responded. "We're sticking to 1 hour." The boat drove off and we were stuck in the ocean. You'd think there would be plenty of chatter to pass the time, but nobody was saying a word. Eric was lying on his back while a few others elected to stay vertical and paddle their feet. The sun beat down on us while we shivered. Just because it's California doesn't mean the water is going to be warm. I lay on my back and floated for what felt like an eternity. I imagined what I'd be doing after taking the test when it was over. The thought of having a secure future brought me the hope I needed to continue on. I checked my watch. 34 minutes had passed. I looked around to see how the others were doing, and I noticed someone was missing. I brought it up to everyone else, and we scanned the waters around us to see if they'd floated off. We didn't see anyone. "Fuck this," a woman said in the commotion. "I'm swimming back to shore. Who's coming with me?" I looked at Eric. We were both considering it, but when he said he was staying there, I agreed to stay with him. A man in the group joined her as they set off for the coast. It was me, Eric, and the asshole who thought he was too good for the tests. Eric and I talked to pass the time after the others left. We wondered if they'd be able to swim that far before they'd succumb to fatigue. The thought of your body giving up with no escape for safety scared us. He also told me about how he'd been unemployed for about 6 months and needed this badly to support his family. I told him I just didn't know what else I was going to do if this didn't work out. I checked my watch. It had been 1 hour and 18 minutes since they dropped us off. "Well, you got your wish for a 2-hour test," I said to the guy stranded with us. "Good," he replied sharply. "Survival of the fittest." I'd known the guy for a couple of hours, and I hated him. I didn't even know his name. My gut feeling was to abandon him and swim to shore with Eric. We waited for the boat to come, but time was not on our side. We were dropped off about 1:30. It was 2:50, and sunset was at 5. It dawned on me that they never asked for physicals from us, nor did they ask if we had any prior health conditions. They just took whoever showed up and threw them into these tests. By 3:51, I'd about given up hope. We were tired. Even though lying on my back was no exercise, the endless waves were beating me down. My fingers and toes were completely numb, and I couldn't see the shoreline at all at this point. "I can't do it anymore," Eric said to me. He was white. His rosy cheeks had lost all color. His eyes conveyed more information than any of his words could. They were empty. I wasn't looking at Eric anymore. I saw a broken man. I saw what happens when you lose everything. He started to sink when I swam over to him. I thrashed violently, trying to get to him in time, but I couldn't save him. I dove below the surface to try and grab him, but he was too far down to save. I watched him sink until the water turned black. "Shouldn't have tried to get a job in the water," the man said. When he said that, I lost her. I swam over to him and wrapped my hands around his neck. His slight grin turned to panic as I held him under the water. His eyes opened wide as his arms thrashed through the surface. "Maybe you shouldn't either," I screamed as I held him down. I felt his heartbeat racing as my hands clasped around his neck, tighter and tighter. The fight was over. His eyes rolled back, his arms and legs draped below his lifeless body as I released him. He sank, and I was alone. Minutes later, the boat returned. The man administering the tests helped me into the boat and congratulated me on passing the test. It was 4:06. I had been in the water a lot longer than the hour he'd promised. "Why'd you come back so late?" I asked. "Boat issues," he replied without even looking in my direction. We arrived back at the facility, where the woman behind the counter returned my phone and wallet to me. "Hey, can you tell me what Eric's last name is?" I asked. "It's Griffin," she responded. "You can expect an email within the next few days. We have employers who are excited to interview our candidates." I thanked her and left the building. I looked on Facebook and found his page. I sent a message to his wife letting her know what happened. The next day, the bodies of the two participants that tried to swim back to shore were found. They had injuries that didn't match up with shark attacks. The cause of death was unknown. I never got a single email offering me a job. Eric's wife messaged me back a few weeks later, telling me they settled on a lawsuit. She got $2 million. It wasn't worth it to her. She would have taken Eric back over the $2 million in a heartbeat. Money doesn't replace people, but people can be bought with a broken promise of hope. I was struggling after the first run of trials. I'd see Eric's dead body drifting into the abyss in my dreams. Every time I would shower, the water hitting me reminded me of Chloe's screams in the pool. I saw online that Chloe passed away. Those swimming under my feet weren't rescue divers. They were disposing of the bodies before the lights turned on. This wasn't just for Eric and Chloe. This was for all of us. I reached out to the police in an effort to make sure this didn't happen again. I sat down at the police station in a rusted metal chair as I watched officers hustle people in and out of rooms. The occasional bail here, a distressed victim there. As I've witnessed, there's too much tragedy in life, and this was a hot spot for the brutal aftermath of it. My name was called, and I sat down across from a detective at his desk. I witnessed people die due to the negligence of a company just an hour south of us, I said. Everyone else died, but there was a lawsuit against them that won. Shouldn't that be enough, along with my testimony, to prove something bad happened? Sure thing, he responded. Tell me what happened. I went to this place offering jobs to people who were good in the water, I said. They'd get us connected with job opportunities after some tests. Aqua-hiring? He interrupted. Yes, that's the place, I replied. Do you know about them? Yep, he said. We've launched investigations into them in the past. We never found anything out of the ordinary. But people have died there, I pleaded. He leaned in close enough for me to smell the morning coffee and cigarettes he huffed down on his way to work. Listen, there's nothing more we can do, he said. My wife went there 3 years ago. Never came back. His blue eyes trembled as he fought back tears. He had pictures of his wife on his desk. She was beautiful. The happiness he once displayed died along with her. I knew he cared, and he wanted to help. This was above him, and the whole local police force, for that matter. I did nothing for the next couple of days. Not exactly nothing. I contemplated. I sat like a prisoner in a cell, just wondering what I could possibly do. My walls weren't holding me in. My conscience was. I couldn't accept defeat, not this easily. I looked around online to see what kind of technology I could use to spy on the facility. Unless I could attach a camera to a nearby streetlight or find a James Bond-style device that would let me spy in on conversations through the walls, I was out of luck. Then an idea dawned on me. I had a buddy back in college who works for an online news source. I never read it, but he might know a thing or two about getting the truth and amplifying it more than any court case or a social media post can. I gave him a call later that day. "Spencer," he asked. "Surprised to hear from me. How the hell are you?" "Not great, Matty," I replied. "If you were to find some kind of corruption, or write an article to expose something, how would you do it?" Well, that's tricky," he responded. "If I was trying to get the truth from someone without them knowing, I'd go in mic'd up." "That's not an option," I said. "They know me, and I doubt they want anything to do with me." "Then I'd either go in undercover or send in a buddy," he replied. "What if I went to a different location of theirs, where they don't know me?" I asked. "I suppose that could work," he said. "Need a wire?" "No, I need something waterproof," I said. He sent me a link to a waterproof watch with a built-in microphone. Nothing that could capture video proof, but theoretically audio along with my testimony could be compelling. I searched Aquahiring LLC, and the second closest facility was 149 miles away. It'd be a haul, but worth it if my plan actually worked. I called to see if I could get more information as to what kind of testing would be done, but it was the same bullshit I was told from my first experience. I determined if I was going to get proof, I'd have to suffer again. I made the long haul 3 days later and went through the same procedure as last time. However, this time I used a fake name. In case they had Spencer Hicks on file, I'd go by Dylan Johnson. While I sat nervously in my seat, I looked around at everyone surrounding me. I felt somewhat responsible for what would happen to them if I had the information to save all of them. I wrestled with my thoughts for a while before determining this was the only way to save people in the future. We were escorted by a young woman into another pristine room filled with sci-fi looking equipment. As my peers looked on with amazement, I saw nothing but devices built for the purpose of pushing a body past its limits. We walked towards the pool with the same dimensions as the previous one. We waded out to the middle and assumed our positions. After treading for 10 minutes, the same machines as the prior ones began vibrating up and down. Gentle waves moved us around, which forced nobody out of the pool. I was prepared for the lights to cut out when nearly the opposite happened. You must be able to remain calm even through the most disorienting events, the woman said as bright lights of every color burst from the ceiling. At the same time, the machines jerked sideways from opposite sides, creating an undertow. This was new. I couldn't see my own hands as lights bombarded my eyes. The current was pulling everyone, including me, under the water every few seconds. It felt like someone was pulling my feet violently as I struggled to resurface. Gasps of breath, which only caused my lungs to burn, were my only means of survival. After only 4 minutes of this, 5 of us remained. The ones who couldn't pass this test have been escorted out, the woman said. You've earned a lunch before your next test. I didn't make any friends during this. The last thing I needed was to make relationships with people who were walking tombstones in my eyes. After a meal, I returned to see another beautiful boat sitting near the parking lot. I fought every urge in my body to run. Gut feelings can give you a lot of information. Your brain telling you to run is another. I walked back into the main room and waited. The woman escorted us to the boat where we drove into the ocean. Our pool can only simulate the ocean so well. She said, "This is a true test of your endurance. We'll be monitoring you guys from a safe distance, and we'll be back in 1 hour to retrieve you." We jumped out of the boat in a single-file line, but as the last girl was preparing to leave, I saw the woman give her a pat on the back. The girl winced in pain as she fell out and the boat drove off. After no more than 2 minutes in the water, we noticed streaks of red floating around us. I asked the girl to turn around, and I noticed a small cut on her back. "That bitch cut me," she said. Her wound was the least of my worries. We were in the middle of the ocean with blood in the water. "Okay, listen. We have to swim back as a unit," I said. "There's safety in numbers, and we have to make sure she's okay." "Hell no," a guy chimed in. "She can swim back to the shore, and you can be her bodyguard. I'm landing a job." "You don't understand. They're not coming back," I yelled. But it didn't matter. Either I confessed everything to them or I played along. "At least not for an hour," I continued. "It's a small cut. I'll be fine," she said in an effort to calm down the situation. "Everyone just take a deep breath. We can pass the time with a few stories. Who wants to go first?" Before anyone spoke up, the man behind me was pulled underwater. We turned around and saw his forearm barely connected to a hand float to the surface. Veins stuck out. Fat and muscle clung to the shattered remains of the bones. Blood surrounded us as panic set in. She wasn't cut on accident. This was the same test, just modified. "Stop swimming and thrashing," I yelled in an effort to save the others. "It only attracts more sharks." I spun around, looking everywhere I could to watch for sharks incoming. One of the men in the water began crying. He told us he wanted to tell his wife he loved her one last time. Every passing second felt like minutes in my head. This wasn't a test of endurance. We were playing Russian roulette with a chamber full of bullets, and it all depended on who was under the gun next. "I see one coming. Please help!" The girl with the cut yelled as a shark jumped out of the water and grabbed her. She continued to scream and pled to us as we watched it jerk her back and forth. Her outstretched hands, reaching for hope, only grasped the air. She'd never breathe again. She was being thrown around like a rag doll, showing just how helpless we were in comparison to the predators swarming us. Within 10 seconds, she was cut in half. There were only 3 of us left. "Fuck this, man. I'm going back to shore," said the man who initially refused to leave. He swam about 20 feet before he met the same death the others had. I looked around me. I was greeted by an arm, half a woman, the other a man who was terrified. "If you swim back to the shore on your back, you'll be fine," I said. "Just don't paddle and move around so much that it draws attention to you." I knew it was a lie, and I knew he'd be found dead. This was necessary. I had to make sure I got out alive with the evidence to finally end this horrible company. Before he began swimming, the boat returned, and the woman, along with a few other workers, swiftly dragged us back into the boat. "I'm so sorry that happened," she said. "We came in as soon as we could." I knew she was lying through her teeth. I could have said something, but everything I'd been through from that point on would have been for nothing. We returned to the facility where, to my surprise, the testing wasn't over. "We just have one last test before you're all done," she said happily. 3 people were mauled to pieces, and she was acting as if nothing had happened. We were escorted back into the facility, where we entered a large room with 2 tanks filled with water. "Hop into these tanks where we're going to have you hold your breath," she said. "Give us a wave when you can't go any longer, and we'll open them for you. Also, Mr. Johnson, can you give me your watch?" "Why?" "I like to have it on me," I asked. "It monitors my heart rate, and I just feel naked without it on my wrist." "Our tanks receive signals from our computers, and any kind of technology can interfere with it," she said. "You'll get it back along with your phone and wallet afterward." I knew she was lying to me. Her brown bangs couldn't hide the malice in her eyes. I reluctantly handed over my watch, but left the microphone running just in case she held onto it during the testing. These tanks were above ground, with steel beams holding them up. They were about 3 feet off the ground and roughly 7 feet tall. They were just wide enough to house a person in them. As I climbed a ladder on the side and descended into the tank, along with the guy who survived the ocean with me, the top sealed shut. I felt the claustrophobia set in as the round glass entrapped me. I had a realization after being in there for only a few seconds. I couldn't move my arms. How was I supposed to wave to them if I needed to be released? I remained as still as I could as I watched the clock on the north wall. The seconds hand danced slowly as if mocking me. We were both trapped behind a wall of glass, but its battery would last longer than my lungs. I looked over to the man in the second tank as he began flinching. We had been holding our breath for over 2 minutes, and he didn't have much longer. His head jerked back and forth as his body slammed against the glass. He was pounding his fists against the walls, but couldn't break them as his arms were forced against his sides. His screams for help were imprisoned to the bubbles bursting from his mouth, swarming around his head. My own lungs were constricting, but I still had time. A fire burned in my chest as I watched him become motionless. The lid to my tank opened seconds later. "We'll have medical professionals tend to him," she said to me. "He'll be okay." I walked back into the waiting area to gather my belongings from the man behind the sheet of glass, where he handed me my phone, wallet, and watch. "You have a great day now, Mr. Hicks," he said. I froze. They knew me. Nobody came after me, nor did they attempt to stop me from leaving. I quickly walked out of the building back to my car. I looked through my phone. They didn't touch it. I then inspected my watch. Hopelessness is the only word I can use to describe what came over me. Never in my life have I felt so defeated and filled with despair. They removed the memory card from my watch.
An armadillo's carcass baked in the sun. Pebbles of loose gravel bounced and rattled as the silver Ford coupe rumbled over it. "There's another one!" "Yeah, well, what do you expect, Joey? It's Arkansas." "But it's like the 5th one we've seen," Joey said. "In Texas, I bet they use them to make lines down the highway, to keep drivers awake." "Well, I know I couldn't doze off thinking about those dead, beady eyes staring at me the whole time," Joey said. Roger laughed and the Ford swerved. Joey started to say something, but the car realigned to the center of the road. Roger had been driving like that since they'd begun up the mountain. In some cultures, the armadillo's a bad omen." "What do you mean?" Roger asked. "They say if you see a dead armadillo on a journey, you'll never come back." They looked at each other. Roger turned back to the road every 5 seconds. "Oh, you're just screwing with me." "No, I'm serious. Armadillos were warnings of a horrible death." "Even if I believe that crap, the place we're headed is full of poor bastards that are a lot closer to death's door than we are." "What kind of name is 56, anyway?" "I don't know. Maybe that's the town's population," Roger said. "I haven't seen anything outside of run-down churches for the last 25 miles. An 18-wheeler raced towards them, straight down the middle of the mountain road. Joey clutched the ceiling handle in Roger's shoulder. Roger jerked the car to the right and onto a patch of bushes just in time. The truck's blaring horn faded fast. Roger slammed his hand onto the wheel. "Yeah, I can hit the horn too, asshole." "I knew something like this would happen," Joey thought. "You okay?" Roger asked. "Yeah." "And do you mind pulling your fingers out of my shoulder?" Joey let go, but kept his right hand squeezed on the ceiling handle as they continued over the hill. Thick, ominous clouds moved and slowly Endless rows of green hills spanned the distance, and a red farmhouse sat deep and far away in the valley. Joey watched Roger throw a bottle to the floor beside his feet, adding it to the pile of other trash. In his paranoia, he imagined one of the empty bottles rolling behind the brake pedal, preventing its use, sending them flying off the mountain. He shuddered at the thought. The road curved and became steep again, and Joey braced himself for another surprise, but the car turned onto a hidden trail just at the top of the rise. They moved up a gravel drive with patches of greenery sprouting all over. Dust signaled their arrival as they passed a sign hanging from two crooked chains. Sparrow Ridge. The letters were painted in black. Splinters protruded from around a blocky figure that Joey could only assume was an etching of the home's namesake. The structure was just as old and smoky. The windows glowed a dark orange in the dwindling afternoon light. As they pulled up to the old house, Joey noticed a moldy substance coating various parts of the loose paneling. He could even smell the age and decay from the car's open window. After the dust settled, a short, husky woman stepped out onto the porch. Her hair was curled and messy. She gave a single swiping wave and dropped her arm back to her side before descending the porch steps. She walked towards the two men climbing out of the car. "You boys are almost late," she said. "Charlene Elkins." Roger Grubbs," he said, shaking her outstretched hand. "Joey Murch." "Well, get your things and come on in." She turned to the house, shuffled back onto the porch, and through the screen door. Joey and Roger walked around to the trunk. "This broad's crazy. Almost late?" Joey said, removing a suitcase. "Isn't that the same thing as being on time?" Roger laughed, and they stepped onto the porch. Joey noticed an old gas can to the left, sitting in the space where he suspected a swing would have been. He looked at the ceilings and saw two rusty hooks, but nothing more. Inside the house smelled like dead flowers. The lighting was hazy, and the combination of pastel coral-colored walls made Joey feel lightheaded. Miss Elkins waited at the bottom of a staircase. "Your rooms are upstairs and down the hall, the last two on the right. Once you get settled, come back down and I'll introduce you to everybody." Roger led the way and stopped at the second to the last door. "I guess this is mine," he said. Small slips the size of fortune cookie paper were stuck to each door with the men's respective names typed in a swirly black font. Joey's door opened with a creak. A tall bed covered in quilts rested against the far left wall. No windows. He placed his suitcase on a steamer trunk at the foot of the bed and met Roger in the hall. "This place looks like Norman Bates is going to pop out of a closet," Joey said. "No, come on. It's just old and country. You'll have 2 weeks to get used to it. Besides, we took my car, and you can't leave without me. A decision that's revealing itself more unwise by the minute." "Smartass," Roger said, stomping back down the stairs. They met Miss Elkins in front of two wooden sliding doors. "Before we go into the living room, I want to brief you on a few things." They nodded. "I only hire the best CNAs, and both of you come highly recommended." However," she said, "I have higher standards than anywhere that you have or will work." Joey tried to hold back a swallow, but couldn't stop. Miss Elkins continued. "That's why I require 2 weeks on and 2 weeks off, but it's always why I pay more." She folded her chubby arms against her chest. "We're like a family, so while you're staying here, I expect you to keep your rooms clean, help with the dishes after every meal, and be the first to come to the aid of any one of our residents at any time of the day or night. Is that clear?" "Yes, ma'am," Roger said, and Joey nodded. "All right, then." She turned and parted the sliding doors as if it were a carnival attraction. Several elderly were spread throughout the room, in wheelchairs, sharing small love seats, benches, and stools, and some sat watching Wheel of Fortune. A thin, middle-aged woman in scrubs stood against the wall to the right of the television. Miss Elkins pointed to her. "Nurse Hale, could you turn it off for a minute?" The woman did, rousing agitated groans from the spectators. "Now don't get huffy. We'll turn it back on in a second," Miss Elkins said. "I want to introduce each of you to Roger Grubbs and Joey, Murph, is it? Murch." Joey corrected. Murch. "They're here to take good care of you for the next 2 weeks, and hopefully," she looked back at both of them, "further in the future." She led the men around the room to meet each resident. Behind the seated group, a droopy man paced back and forth with a walker. Every few seconds, he farted and then apologized. His name was Landon Ellery, and he kept the same routine from morning until night, pacing, farting, and apologizing. Daniel Ron, dressed in a fine-pressed suit and shiny wingtips, eyed the new help from his wheelchair. An expression of disdain held on his face. "You pricks look like you couldn't tie your own shoes," he said. Miss Elkins explained that he was the eldest and most ornery inhabitant, next to Oliphant Jackson. The shriveled black woman sat on a small stool against the wall, staring into the air. Her eyes were a pale blue, and her brow was scrunched up as if lost in thought. Joey stepped towards her and kneeled down. He was about to introduce himself, but she jabbed her cane into his gut, making him stagger back. "Best not get too close, you hear?" Miss Jackson said. Roger lost his ability to contain his amusement. Miss Elkins shook her head. "I'm sorry, I should have warned you. Miss Jackson likes to poke," Miss Elkins said, and lowered her voice to a whisper. "She's also blind." "It's okay," Joey said, holding his stomach. Solomon Douglas sat against a floral-patterned love seat. He wheezed with folded arms, sitting in a stiff position. He sat next to a man and woman holding hands. The twins, Arthur and Eunice Griffin. Arthur wore black horn-rimmed glasses and a bow tie. Eunice kept her hair in a bun and wore pearls around her neck. A soft yelp came from the other side of the room. "Mr. Cox!" Miss Wilkins called out. Stood embarrassed next to a wrinkled man sitting in a rocking chair, clutching his right hand. "This is Felcher Cox," Miss Elkins said with a stiff hand pointed in his direction. "Be sure to watch him when Nurse Hale is around. He can't control himself, and don't be afraid to secure him in his room. His children have already signed off on that." "Stuck-up cow," he said as she passed. She popped a glare at him, and he jerked back into the rocker, sliding his hand around the straps of his overalls. Basil Billings laughed and slapped his knees. He had long white hair down to his shoulders, and a trimmed goatee. "Basil likes to help his fellow guests by ingesting their medicine, don't you, Basil?" He laughed and held his arms up as if he were being mugged. "What are you laughing at, Mrs. Billings?" Daniel Ron asked. The others joined in chanting, "Mrs. Billings, Mrs. Billings." Basil plunked his head down and brought clasped hands over his face. "Now stop it, everyone!" Miss Elkins yelled before turning back to Joey and Roger. They all call him that because of his long hair. She patted Basil's shoulder and continued on. Sergeant Carson sat in a recliner with medals pinned to the pockets of his flannel shirt. He had fought in both the Korean and Second World War. "Don't make any sudden popping noises around him. He'll fling himself to the ground and cuss and shout. And the last incident took us over an hour to put him back in his chair." Greta Bayless's granddaughter had come flaunting a helium balloon that she'd received at a restaurant in Mountain View. When it burst, the noises of a screaming girl and a vulgar veteran yelling flooded the house. Greta Bayless smiled as far as her dimples would allow. She sat in her wheelchair and clapped her hands together when the men approached. As Miss Elkins introduced them, Greta opened her mouth to speak, but her dentures plopped onto her lap. Greta looked down at her false teeth, and then back up at the boys, grinning. Miss Elkins helped her put them back in. "They're gonna put a hole in my head," Greta said. "Oh," said Joey. "That's nice." He looked back at Roger. "Now don't go telling stories, Mrs. Bayless," Miss Elkins said. I guess we better get dinner over with. Nurse Hale, boys, can you help everybody into the dining room? She wheeled Greta Bayless into the next room, and the others followed. The table wobbled under the weight of ham, sweet potatoes, greens, and a steaming dish of cherry cobbler. Joey tried not to pay attention to the disgusting way some of the residents ate, or how Mrs. Jackson seemed to stare at him with her sky-blue eyes. He could have waved his hands in front of her face, but didn't want to chance another poke in the stomach. After he and Roger finished up the dishes and helped everyone to their rooms, they went their separate ways and called it a night. The first thing Joey noticed when he closed his door was the lack of a lock. He thought it was one of those cheap push-and-turn knobs. No such luck. He looked for something to prop against the door, something at least to slow down a wandering geriatric who might catch him undressing. Deciding that he was being irrational, and that the trunk would make too much noise, he gave a sigh and stripped down to his boxer briefs. Taking off his digital watch, he set an alarm for the morning and placed it on a post at the foot of the bed. Joey walked over and flicked the light off. The room was so dark he couldn't even see the images in his head. He moved forward with caution, but bumped his shin against the wooden chest and swore under his breath. Everything sounds louder in the dark. He listened for a moment, but only heard the distant wheezing of Solomon Douglas across from Roger's room. He slipped into bed. The sheets were cool against his bare skin, and the feeling was enjoyable. Even though he was comfortable, he was also frightened. As a kid, he had imagined horrible things living in the shadows. Even as an adult, he was unable to suppress the thoughts. Joey stared between the door and the ceiling, or at least where he thought they were, before the world went black. A quick, sharp creak jolted Joey awake. The door. But when he looked up, no light peeked in from the hall. The door was still closed. His first instinct was to go back to sleep, but his mind wouldn't let him. He laid there, letting the silence of the strange place wash over him. A steady scratching sound caused his body to tense. In the blackness, he couldn't tell where the noise was coming from, but knew it was with him, in the room. He held tight to the covers and drew his knees against his chest. Not that he thought that it would be much protection, but it was all he could do aside from risking the trek to the light switch. The scraping became louder and longer in stride, like someone raking a knife into a thick log. Every bone and ligament urged him to move, to jump, to run. His mind exploded with images of awful things. He tried to fight the thoughts, but that just made them more vivid. The sawing sound stopped. Joey moved his head around, listening carefully. But nothing happened. His body relaxed. A dull pain ached in his legs from the cramped position. Maybe it was just in my head, he thought. The dark always plays tricks on me. It was a strange place, and his subconscious was just expressing its discomfort. Nothing more. The thought calmed him, until he fell back to sleep. The next morning, the door flew open while he was dressing in his scrubs. Joey spun around with his arms up, posed to attack. "Don't shoot!" Roger chuckled. "You scared the crap out of me!" "My bad." "Did you hear any weird scratching noises last night?" Joey asked. "Nah, slept like a rock," Roger replied. "You'd better hurry up. Miss Elkin wants us downstairs in 5 minutes. "Fine. I just need to find my shoes and I'll be right behind you." Joey checked behind the wooden chest, even inside, but found nothing but cobwebs and a hot, sour stench. He closed the drawers and got on his knees to inspect under the bed. His heart raced as he looked at the shoes sitting neatly together against the far wall. He was sure he hadn't put them in such an inconvenient place. As he reached for them, his mind fell back to the sounds from the previous night. Someone had to have been in there and moved his shoes as a joke. He lowered himself closer to the ground and pushed farther under the bed. His head knocked against a wooden support board. Closing his eyes, he waited for the pain to recede. He rolled onto his back to see what had gotten him, and something etched in the wood caught his attention. The cuts were too strategic to be random. It looked like a message, but if it said anything, he couldn't make it out. There was an L, maybe a T. He brushed away the particles of scratched wood and blinked as the shavings fell into his eyes. I'll eat your heart. Once the words registered, he scrambled from under the bed into the hall and flew down the stairs, swinging around the corner. He bumped into Mrs. Elkins. "What the hell is wrong with you?" There. And where on earth are your shoes?" Joey looked down at his white socks. "This house is old," she said. "Plenty of nails and splinters to stick you." She looked at him with a confused look. "What's the matter?" He could see on Miss Elkins' face that she wouldn't believe him. Or more likely, wouldn't care. "I'm fine. Just excited to start." "Well, go get your shoes and march back down here." She turned around and walked through a swinging door leading to the kitchen. Joey placed his hand on the banister, looked up the dark row of stairs, and sighed. Roger and Joey had years of experience working in nursing homes. And although Sparrow Ridge was secluded and had many strange characteristics in residents, the job was about the same. Miss Elkins' standards were easy enough to make habit. All you had to do was shut up, keep your head down, and do what was asked. Joey wondered when the hard stuff would start. An hour before lunch, Nurse Hale handed him a key and a chart, instructing him to retrieve everyone's medication from the locked cabinet in the kitchen. Entering in through the swinging doors, he saw the cabinet stretched open, and Basil Billings struggling with a bottle of red pills. When the old man saw Joey rushing towards him, he ripped the top off and tried swallowing the evidence. Joey grabbed his arm with one hand and attempted to contain the pills with the other. Basil shook his fists like a baby fighting for a pacifier, and Joey gave a hard pull in the opposite direction. The pills cascaded into the sink, the last one swirling around the hole before dropping in with the rest. "Oh, what the hell, Basil?" Basil dropped to the ground with his hands over his head, rocking back and forth. "All right, look, both of us are going to get in trouble if anyone finds out about this. This is going to be our secret, okay?" Basil nodded. After returning him to the living room, Joey set out a tray and dispensed what remained of the residents' medication. The chart showed every resident having prescribed cocktails as different as their personalities. But they all required the red pill. Shit. Luckily, no one seemed to notice that they were missing. In between attaching IVs and wiping backsides, Joey's mind returned to the etching in the wood as he studied each resident. It had to be one of them. Miss Elkins was too large to be that stealthy, and too professional to pull a prank like that. He also knew Roger would have been overflowing with comical guilt, and since he wasn't acting funny, Joey decided to tell him. He waited until Roger left the main room, then followed him down the hallway and into the bathroom. Did you come in to give me a hand?" "I've got to tell you something." Mr. Cox must have grabbed your ass. "No, listen. That scratching sound I asked you about? I found out what it was." "Yeah?" Roger reached for a roll of brown paper towels. "Someone etched a message in a board under my bed. I'll eat your heart." Roger looked at him, crunching a paper towel between his fists. "Really? Really, Joey? You have to get back to work," he said, shouldering past Joey. "I'm serious," Joey said. But the door had already swung closed. He sighed. Not only did he have the rest of the workday ahead of him, but was certain he was in for an even longer night. After dinner, Roger and Joey escorted each resident to their rooms. The twins complained, kicking and scratching, with Joey attempted to lead Mr. Griffin upstairs. Roger brought Eunice up behind them, assuring Arthur that she was right there with him every inch of the way. Mr. Ron made rude comments, even after being put in bed. Joey was hesitant to work with Mrs. Jackson. Roger snorted and stepped toward her, asking if he could hold the cane. "I suppose," Mrs. Jackson said. Roger walked her towards the staircase, leaving Joey and Greta Baisley alone in the living room. Greta smiled and made her joyful, pleasant applause. "Let's go," he said, and wheeled her to the stairs. Joey took a breath and steadied himself, stepping backwards and pulling her and the chair up each step. She giggled the whole way. Sweat slid down his face and back, and he needed to take 2 breaks before reaching the top. Once there, Joey rested his aching arms against the wheelchair. Resting only increased her laughter, and Joey shook his head and then wheeled her the rest of the way to her room. The walls were pink and bare, except for a calendar with pictures of kittens. Beside the bed stood a white plastic stool, holding up a vase of dying flowers and the remains of a balloon. "Let me hear your heartbeat," Greta said, as Joey tucked her in. What did you say?" "Let me hear your heartbeat." The pitch of her voice took a dive. "No," Joey said, instantly thinking about the etching. "It's bedtime. Let me hear your heartbeat. Let me hear your heartbeat." She chanted the words, sang them, louder and louder. The smile never left her face. It became crooked, revealing her blocked false teeth. Joey stepped backwards towards the door. Miss Elkins rushed in, a syringe in hand. She pushed down hard on the old woman's left arm, removed the cap of the needle with her mouth, and then injected it. But Greta's arm flailed. "Help me hold her down!" Joey pressed his weight on Greta Bayless's side as Miss Elkins injected red liquid into a bulging vein. Greta's body relaxed, and the droning of her loud chant quieted. Miss Elkins removed the syringe and covered the old woman with a blanket. "Did she take her pills today?" He nodded and followed Miss Elkins into the hall. "What's wrong with her?" Joey asked. "They sometimes get that way when they're getting close to passing." "How long do you think she has?" "Hard to say. This might be her last night at Sparrow Ridge," she said matter-of-factly. Miss Elkins walked towards the staircase and lifted a hand in good night. Joey returned the wave, even though he knew that she couldn't see it, and entered his bedroom. He shut the door behind him, moving the chest against the door, and then went to the far wall. The bed was heavy, but he managed to scoot it away from the corner. He got behind the bedpost and shoved it against the door. Joey left the light on. He also kept his clothes on, and placed his shoes on top of the nightstand, before slipping under the sheets. He was more comfortable in the light. "Just have to get through a few days," Joey thought, before he drifted off to sleep. The door rumbled against the foot of the bed. The room was dark somehow. Joey jumped up and crept towards the light switch. Again the door shook. Someone was trying to get in, someone stronger than Greta Bayless, or anyone else in the house. Stretching his arm, he flicked the switch. Nothing happened. His heart sped up as his mind raced with outlandish possibilities. Joey searched for the nightstand and clumsily slipped his shoes on, lifting his head every few seconds, looking at the door, wondering why no one else seemed to hear it, and if they did, where were they? He moved behind the bed and placed both hands on top of the headboard, ready to push to keep the door shut. Everything went quiet. Outside, Joey heard slow, measured steps. In between each creak of the wood, the thing on the other side hissed. He heard the person move away from his door and across the hall. At first, he was relieved that it went away, until he realized they might be heading for Roger's room. "Oh shit!" Joey muffled behind his palms. Joey heard Roger's door creaking open. He wanted to move to help his friend, but he was in shock. The amount of fear persuading his body outweighed his conscience. He froze. Low vibrations bounced against the wall in tune of Roger's voice. Furniture shuffled, something shattered, and then Roger screamed. Joey scrambled for his suitcase in the dark and began searching for the flashlight that he had packed. After retrieving it, he pulled the bed clear of the door, and once in the hallway, Joey took a breath and tried to listen for any movement, holding the flashlight in his hands like a weapon. Everything was silence once more. He stepped towards Roger's room slowly. The door stood wide open, and after a silent prayer, Joey clicked on the flashlight and took a step into the room, convinced that his mind was playing tricks on him, that it was all a dream. Something was under the sheet, on top of Roger's bed. It didn't move. Sensing someone behind him, Joey spun around, quickly shining the light onto every corner and shadow. No one there. He squatted to the floor and peered under the bed. Empty. There was still the sheet to check. The form was indistinct. He stretched his thumb and index finger to a corner of the fabric and pulled hard and fast. Roger's throat lay ripped open, the wound mashed and drying. His body looked starved, and his dead eyes held an expression of terror. Joey choked on vomit and tried to yell. At the same time, he fell, shaking. The light pierced upward against the ceiling, illuminating the impossible. Greta Bayliss hung from it by her hands and feet. Joey screamed. The old woman's eyes were crazed and deep, and her skin was dark gray. She heaved in a strange rhythm, with gobs of blood oozed from her gaping maw. Joey backed away on his hands, kicking at the ground with her purchase. She hissed. Her slimy dentures fell out of her mouth, left in their place were jagged rows of sharp, bloodied fangs. Joey screamed again, this time finding his feet. He rushed for the hallway. The creature dropped down and slashed his back with what felt like a handful of railroad spikes. Reeling in pain, he swung around and bashed the flashlight against her temple. She crumpled to the ground. The flashlight spun and wobbled on the hardwood floor, revealing only quick flashes of what lay in front of him. Long, sharp claws protruded from her fingers, covered in crimson gore. He realized it was his blood trickling along their lengths. Making sure she stayed down, he gave a quick kick to her gut, turned, and lurched for the doorway. He had to find Miss Elkins. A hand gripped around his ankle, and he shrieked. He turned to see Greta Bayliss, baring her teeth in demonic laughter. He went to kick her in the face, but pulled his leg back when her mouth widened to the size of a bowling ball. Joey shook free of her grip, and Greta jumped to her feet. Joey ran from the room, slamming the door just before she crashed into it, shaking the frame. Claws scraped at the wood. It wouldn't be long before she burst through. He kept a firm grip on the trembling doorknob and leaned forward, searching for an escape. His eyes adjusted to the dark enough to see Solomon Douglas's room. In one fluid action, Joey got off the knob and advanced into the next room, closing the door behind him. Joey heard Greta burst into the hallway. He pressed himself against the cold wood, gritting his teeth and trying to hold his breath. Her raging screams dimmed into a ravenous hiss as her steps inched toward Solomon's door. Joey braced his entire body, but relaxed when he heard Greta pass by and run down the stairs. His relieved breath woke Solomon Douglas. Who's there?" he wheezed. "You shouldn't be in here." Joey ignored him. "Get out!" Mr. Douglas made a horrible wet noise like he was coughing up a lung. "Shut up!" Mr. Douglas began chanting and mumbling. The outline of the man shifted. The gasping noises slowed. For a brief moment, Joey calmed down, and he felt a pang of guilt for yelling at the old man. "Just Stay calm, Mr. Douglas. Mr. Douglas began to writhe under the blanket, his back bending and his chest heaving. Please keep quiet, okay? Joey asked, trying to decide if he should go to his aid and risk leaving the door unguarded. After a few minutes of Mr. Douglas's body jerking up and down like he was in the throes of a seizure, his body went stiff. Joey relaxed from the door, but kept his foot wedged at the bottom. His eyes stung as his mind fought to make sense of the past few minutes. Images of Roger's corpse, the words under the bed, the beast that was Greta flashed through his mind. The moment of reflection broke with Solomon's body jerked. The body jerked again, faster, and suddenly Mr. Solomon flew from his bed, screaming like a banshee. Joey abandoned the door and tried to subdue Solomon. He pushed him back, then grabbed the blanket from the bed. He attempted to wrap it around the man's head, but in vain. Joey's strength was easily overthrown. The creature tossed Joey forward and broke off a piece of wood from the bed frame. Mr. Douglas jumped towards him, but Joey skirted and ran for the door. Before he reached the knob, he yelped as the wood hit him bluntly in the back. He stumbled into the hallway, slamming the door behind him. Aching cries and hisses echoed from every room as he made his way through the house. He carefully moved towards the stairs. Greta was nowhere to be seen. Joey tried to keep quiet, but his shoes squeaked with each step from the blood thick on the hallway floor. Midway down the stairs, Joey turned back to see Mr. Douglas clawing along the side of the wall. Other deranged residents spilled from their rooms, and Joey jumped the remaining stairs and landed hard against the floor. Ignoring the pain, he hurried towards the front door. Something grabbed his scrubs and yanked him to the side. Joey's screams were muffled against a hand cupped over his lips. Shh! Nurse Hale loosened her grip. She kept her gaze through the small slits in the door blinds as she whispered, "Thank goodness you're all right. Where's Roger?" Joey shook his head. "Oh, what a mess. What a mess we're in," she said. "The patients aren't normal. And when they're close to dying, the thirst takes over." "What the hell are you talking about?" "You've seen it yourself. They need blood to keep going, and the darkness inside of them helps them get in. These things, they crawl on the walls and the ceilings. They have claws and teeth the size of ice picks. I have a hard time believing that this is just a last-ditch effort to fulfill a bucket list. You're not listening to me. These things were born in this way. There haven't been many, but the ones that pop up..." She locked her arms together. "When whatever shred of humanity they have dies, all that's left is darkness, and all they want is to eat." Joey thought if Roger were alive, he would have made some crack about grampires. He wished he could laugh. He shook his head at the sound of one of the beasts nearing the closet. "How do you know all this?" She let out a long hot breath that smelled sweet. "When other nursing homes see the changes, they send them to us. We're out of the way, up in the mountains. Small doses of blood inside the gel capsules ease the passing, but that isn't important now. We need to get out of here." "Shit! Those little red pills. Of course it would be those pills." He took a deep breath and wiped his forehead. "I didn't give them out." Joey spoke more to himself, still looking out the slats. "You what?" "It was Basil. He was trying to down the whole bottle. I tried to stop him, and the pills are gone. That was the only thing keeping them settled." "Where's Miss Elkins?" Joey asked for a moment. Screams littered the air, echoing through the hollow old house. "I think she's trapped in her room with Mrs. Bayliss." Joey tensed up at the name. The screams echoed for another moment, and another creature walked by. Joey heard the claws digging into the walls and ceiling. Again the house fell silent. Nurse Hale shifted in front of Joey and turned the handle, cracking the door. Joey gripped her arm. She patted his hand, trying to assure him. "That's a girl." The voice wasn't human. Nurse Hale was jerked through the door and into the embrace of Fletcher Cox. "Say, boy, ain't she a peach?" Fletcher said, smacking Nurse Hale's backside with his fingers, digging into the meat. "Let her go!" Joey yelled, and burst out of the closet after her. "Just a minute, boy." The thing bit into her neck. Whipping its head back and forth, Nurse Hale screamed until her throat was torn out. Joey ran along the walls and grabbed a poker from the old fireplace set. He charged forward, swinging, and luckily lodged the poker into Cox's skull. The creature laughed from blood-drenched jaws. He dropped Nurse Hale's dried-up shell and yanked the metal rod from his head. Rushing at Joey before he could react, Cox stabbed him through the shoulder, pinning him to the wall. "How do you like that, boy?" The old man's flesh tore from around his mouth as it expanded the width of Joey's head, moving closer. The blow to its brain did nothing. He was just as fast and strong. Joey grabbed the poker and ripped it from his shoulder. In a scream of pain, he turned and thrust it into the beast's chest. The poker impaled Fletcher Cox's chest all the way to the shaft. He felt the stale heat of the creature's teeth radiating on his neck, but was glad at least that they weren't moving. The creature sprayed a soft mist of blood against it. For a moment, Joey looked at him in the eyes, and then shoved the body to the ground. The cold, marshy flesh fell against the wooden floor with a wet slap. He wiped the blood from his face and then turned his head towards the noise erupting from him. The other crazed residents weren't in sight, and that worried and relieved him at the same time. Dropping to the floor and berating himself for not thinking the action through, he vomited. The poker's hook, coming back out, had done more damage to the gaping wound, and fresh blood poured onto the floor. A loud hissing noise filled the house. Joey got to his feet, grabbed the poker, and hid behind a corner. A familiar, flatulent rumble came from the living room. He craned his head and saw Landon Ellery walking away from him. Over the passing of gas, Joey heard a gurgling hiss. Not taking another second, Joey rushed into the living room with the poker pointed ahead of him, the sharp end piercing the creature's back. It roared and swiped its claws and fangs towards Joey before flopping onto the floor. Joey spun his gaze towards the front door. Mrs. Jackson and Sergeant Carson blocked the hall. He looked to his left and saw a tall white door. Only after entering did he realize that it was the basement. Jamming the poker between the knob and the first step, he looked down the dark row of stairs. A neon green light blinked from the space below. A trail of blood stained the wood leading down the stairs. The greenish glow came from a battery-powered lantern on top of a large work desk, and Miss Elkin stood underneath it. Her arms and face shredded to the consistency of ground beef. The cement under her was stained a dry red, evidence of the pool of blood that had been there moments before. And Joey stepped closer, the blinking lamp distorting his vision, causing the shadows to grow and shrink. Miss Elkin's right hand gripped a small keyring. Joey snatched up the keys and turned to the tall metal cabinet by her feet. Unlocking it, he swung the door open and whispered a quick hallelujah. A shotgun rested above several boxes of shells. He gripped it and checked the chamber. The hungry things above began to burst their arms through the door. It wouldn't be long before they were on him. Joey pocketed a box of shells and held the gun tight. A loud roar came from behind him, and without thinking, he turned around and squeezed the trigger. The blast sent him to the floor, and whatever had snuck up behind him hurtled into the wall. He shuffled himself back and rolled the lantern towards the sound of impact. The green light illuminated a shape in the form of Greta Bayliss. The top half of her head was gone, leaving a sharp-toothed mouth. The beast staggered, then soared through the air towards him. Jaw sprang open, tackling him. It pushed its gaping orifice closer to his head. Pieces of skull and brain tissue fell against his eyes and mouth. He strained to fend her. The shotgun lay between their bodies. Joey gripped the gun and forced the barrel against her ribcage. The shot showered gooey debris into the air, and the creature's body went limp. Joey shoved her off of him, and the monster above broke through the door. They fought and writhed over each other like ravenous snakes as they came down the stairs. They attacked Miss Elkin's body first, but realized it had already been drained. They rushed to the mangled corpse of Greta Bayliss. Joey, hiding behind the cabinet, saw his opportunity. He lugged up the stairs, cursing himself for not trying to get the shotgun. Back in the living room, he looked for anything that he could use to block the door. He heaved aside a large table up against the door and a love seat behind the table. The geriatric demons hissed and screamed at him. "Get through that!" A peeling brown arm broke through a gap in the clutter. Joey realized the barricade wouldn't hold them for long. Even if he made a run for it, they would catch him. Suddenly he remembered the can of gas that he had seen on the porch when Roger and him first arrived. He ran out the front door, hoping it wouldn't be empty, and to his relief it was half full. He ran back into the house, gas can in hand. Pieces of broken wood and glass fell along the love seat onto the floor. More hands and arms appeared. Their wailing grew louder. Laughing maniacally, Joey splashed gas over the barricade and reached into his pocket for a lighter. Shit! He ran into the kitchen, the dim moonlight his only guide, and shuffled through each drawer and cabinet. His shoulder throbbing with agony. Rummaging through a pile of wrenches and tape spools, his eyes fell onto a body in the next room. A pack of cigarettes bulged in Nurse Hale's pocket. Screams rang from behind the makeshift barrier. Joey looked up and saw it breaking apart. He snatched the lighter and hurried to the basement entrance. Eunice Griffin climbed over the tilted love seat. Joey lifted the television and bolted towards her, smashing the monitor over her head. She shoved the creature back through the opening, toppling over the others and knocking them backwards. He struck a flame and tossed the lighter into the darkness of the hallway. Something ignited, but only as much as a poorly lit birthday candle. Attaching themselves to the wall and ceiling, the creatures clawed their ways back towards the door. Joey, in a last-ditch effort, chunked the container of gasoline through the opening. It bounced and wobbled down the stairs, splashing its contents all over the woodwork. Flames suddenly blazed up the walls and down the stairs. Suspended, the demons dropped from the ceilings, while others backed away, further into the basement, escaping the fire and screaming. Joey coughed as black smoke invaded his lungs. Tucking his nose and mouth into his top scrub, he scrambled for the door. He ran back onto the porch, falling against his hands and knees. He pulled himself from the deck and onto the dirt. He pushed with everything he had left to get to Roger's car. He yelled out into the warm night air, tears streaming down his cheeks. Joey climbed into the driver's seat. He looked down at the ignition and laughed. The keys were inside, melting with Roger's shriveled corpse. He wiped his eyes and stared at the burning house. He thought he saw movement along one of the windows along the second story. He opened the door and ran down the drive, fighting against the pain and blood loss. He stumbled over the tire ruts in the dirt. The house at his back, shining, bright orange, radiant warmth. Joey fell. He tried to get back up, but he was too weak. His mind drifted to happier thoughts. A moment later, his face crashed into the gravel. Flashing lights attacking an overcast sky. 2 paramedics lifted him into the ambulance, nodding to one another. "Don't haul him in until I get a word," a brown uniformed man called to them, leaning against a squad car. The paramedics nodded, leaving the doors open. Joey saw sheriff's department vehicles, a small fire truck, and people rummaging through the charred remains of Sparrow Ridge. The officer walked towards the ambulance, stepped inside, and took a seat next to Joey. "You're in bad shape, son, but we'll have plenty of time to sort this out later. Right now, I just have one question. I know you and your friend were working here with Charlene Elkins. We've identified her body. There's Hale's body. And then 10 old folks staying here. The only thing I want to know from you, where the hell is Roger Grubbs?"
Ultrasound by Kevin Thomas. Narrated by Jesse Cornett. Part 1. As a science teacher, making the subject interesting was always the biggest challenge. But that was the bit of the job that I loved. Finding some way to make the subject interesting. There were some classes it was really easy. Some were just naturally interested in what made the world tick. Some got all starry-eyed at the idea of infinite universes, destructive black holes, chemical explosions, classifying all the creepy crawlies that lived in the world. Some classes were harder to grab, though, and you had to really find something to pull them in. It was even more fun to figure out, like teaching taxonomical classifications using Pokemon, or using some sci-fi to explore the ideas of space and time. Sometimes just a good old-fashioned blowing something the fuck up. Well, every now and then, though, you had to get a really tough group. It was even worse when it came to teaching a subject that they found particularly dull. And one class in particular was an unholy boiling point of hormone-fueled disruption. I'd love to say I didn't consider them bad kids, but the inbuilt liberal apologism most teachers have hardwired into them can only take so much punishment. Now, they all had their reasons, of course, and broken homes, runaway parents, bad areas, drugs, alcohol, or just plain learning and development needs that we didn't have the time or the funds to accommodate properly. With all the justification in the world, they'd stop every lesson with them from blurring the fine line between learning and riot control. I even approached my head a year for advice or support. He was normally a man who preached the gospel of no child left behind, every child matters, or with religious fervor, in fact. However, even he, having provided cover teaching for the group in a pinch, simply looked at me with sunken, defeated eyes and told me, "You're on your own with him, mate." And the best he could offer would be to steer the school observations away from those classes and to cast a sympathetic eye over my end-of-year results. A token gesture, and it didn't stop the lessons being a constant struggle to retain control. For instance, one kid, Jake, took a lesson about evolution and survival of the fittest to be a personal challenge to his finely honed fighting skills. And the rest of the lesson was primarily concerned with me attempting to stop the class degenerating into a battle royale. I taught a lesson about the alkali metals, a family of metals which have a violent reaction with water, by putting a tiny pea-sized amount in a bowl of water and letting him see it skitter around before popping with a tiny bang. This lesson was rewarded by a break-in to the chemical cupboard that night. That was followed by a missing 100-gram block of potassium and a mysterious explosion that destroyed half the plumbing in the gym's shower block. I was out of ideas, and at the end of my tether, and I'd resigned myself to simply embracing my new role as riot officer and condemning the class to oblivion. However, I had one of those soul-searching moments and thought that, no, everyone deserves one last chance. It was my class, my subject, and damn it, I was a grown-ass man and would not be defeated by a bunch of foul-mouthed, wanking little scroats. And I checked the curriculum, and the next subject to be taught would be sound waves. Ultrasound and subsonic waves in particular. So now I had to find what was the hook to draw them in. Had I known what would happen, I would have stopped right there. But I didn't. I plowed on, trying to find some way to make the subject of sound waves you can't hear interesting. I found plenty of experiments, using ultrasound to break glass. I didn't fancy giving them any excuse to break glass. Using it to break up kidney stones? The kids knew enough about weapons, thanks. Or the way animals use it for navigation. But I didn't fancy teaching them to add horrific new screeches to their Batman impersonations. I'd all but given up on finding anything useful when I stumbled across an article on scientific explanations for the paranormal based on sounds that existed outside the normal hearing range. The article was fascinating. A scientist called Gareth had noticed that certain areas of a particular laboratory made anyone who worked there feel uneasy and scared. Some went as far as to say they'd seen ghosts and shadowy figures in that part of the lab. Few would dare work there, and fewer would dare twice. And being a man of science, the researcher rejected any supernatural claims and set up monitoring equipment around the area to investigate. And what he found was that the area was a hotbed of subsonic sound waves. And there were all kinds of research equipment in and around the lab, like centrifuges and auto stirrers and incubators, all creating sound waves inaudible to the human ear, but that created a feeling of dread and terror in anyone that was subjected to them. Paranormal research critics were quick to point out that while subsonic waves might account for the feelings of dread, they asked how this explains the visions of ghostly and shadowy figures that were also reported in the lab. And Gareth postulated that the waves caused the front of the eyes to vibrate, and that this could distort sight, and inducing visions of horrific shadow men and other tormentors. I even read that Gareth was planning to expand his research into whether this might explain other ghost reports. For instance, the huge increase in ghost sightings during building projects like extensions to the London Underground tube lines. Often blamed on disturbed graves and inappropriate planners, it may be nothing more than subsonic waves caused by digging machines. Yes, this was perfect. I couldn't believe my luck. It was such a simple experiment to set up in the classroom, and even the most hardened little thugs get even quickly silenced when they think ghosts are in the room. And then once they're thoroughly terrified, bam! Science. And I was grinning from ear to ear at this point. I couldn't wait. For the first time ever, I was actually looking forward to the next lesson. I was so naive. I should have looked deeper. The irony of the fact that everything that unfolded from here on out is down to the fact that I, teacher of the worst class in the country, didn't do my homework. And it would have been hilarious were it not for the tragedy of what was to come. I finished my lesson plan and went to bed, getting the last good night's sleep I'd ever enjoy. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Part 2. The morning came and I still had a confident spring in my step. I even treated myself to a nice coffee on the way to work. I started doing that criminal thing that you do when you think you've had a good idea. Then let the fantasy run away with itself. After all, I just figured out how I was going to control that class. My head of year didn't know how to do that. Maybe this would lead to a promotion. Maybe I'd be next in line for the head of department. Maybe I could include it in my book that I was going to write about controlling classrooms. Maybe I'd be invited on TV to explain it, and how I'd turn this obnoxious class around. I knew I was getting way ahead of myself, but hey, it was a daydream for the commute. And where was the harm in letting it run a little? I got to my room, and I started setting up the equipment. They were going to be my first class of the day, so I wouldn't have to wait forever, which was lucky because at this point I could barely contain myself. And the equipment was very simple. There was going to be a simple speaker at the front of the classroom, which was going to be the focal point of the display, but in the back corners there was going to be a simple setup of a couple of metal plates held in front of electromagnets. And they were all going to be set to the same subsonic frequency that Gareth had used, and I hoped the acoustics of the room would amplify the effect. The class piled in and took their places, and they were already starting to play up, but a couple were disquieted by the calm, confident look on my face. There wasn't much that gave any of their teachers cause for that kind of collected facial expression in their classes. Most had a look of barely concealed fear and trepidation, so to see me looking like a Hindu cow shook their confidence. I had to capitalize on this brief period of crumbled bravado before they collected themselves. "Sound!" I bellowed. "What is it?" My question was met with stony silence, as most of my attempts to engage them were. Sound is a form of energy wave. For the most part, it allows us to hear things. I subtly turned on the speakers to their subsonic frequency. It was at a low amplitude, so it's unlikely anyone would be perceiving anything yet. However, scientists are still discovering new ways that the body interacts with energy in all its forms. Every day, we find out new mechanisms by which the body is sensitive to energy. Every day, we find a new way to explain the unexplainable by using rigorous scientific method to observe, predict, experiment, and analyze. I tweaked the intensity up a few notches and saw a few of their bored expressions shift to one much less complacent. I was loving this, truly loving it. I almost didn't know whether I was getting an adrenaline rush from finally controlling this unruly class, or whether the sound waves were starting to get to me too. There was a bubbling panic growing in my chest, but I was sure that was just down to the excitement of the position. Even if I was also being affected, no reason why it wouldn't be, just because I was aware of it. At least I knew that I was in control. And if you kids really apply yourselves, really buckle down and stop giving me shit, I couldn't believe I just wanted my class. The excitement was almost too much. Then maybe you'd be able to use science to achieve something. I paused and scanned over their increasingly distressed faces to ensure I really had them before I went to the grand finale. Really special. I cranked the intensity of the sound way up to full. I saw an instant shift in their demeanor. It was beautiful. A few started crying, some hid their eyes, some were just frantically looking around, wondering if they were the only ones, and quickly seeing that they weren't. I almost started scaring myself. I looked across their terrified faces and watched them scrambling and pleading with me and each other and God, anyone to make it stop. This started to feel like revenge rather than science. Every crappy lesson, every fight, every interruption, every curse, every punch, and every missed piece of homework was all avenged as I watched the class descend into pure, terrified panic. Then, there was a shift. I don't know why I'd been slower to respond, but all of a sudden the sound waves got to me too. All of a sudden, I saw what they were seeing. I understood their fear. Shadowy figures swooped and darted around the peripheries of my vision. The corner of my eye was a dance of barely seen terrors. However, when one of the shadows appeared to dash right across the classroom, I realized I'd gone too far. This was terrifying even for me, and I knew none of it was real. This needed to stop now, before it went any further. I killed the power to all the speakers. Instantly, the room was back to normal. No figures. No shadows. Nothing clawing at the extremities of your vision. Just another classroom full of clearly unsettled children. I regained control of myself and calmly explained to the class exactly what had happened. We went into detail about sound waves and energy transfer and the retina, and the eye's lenses, the whole lot. I knew I'd way overstepped the mark, and I didn't want to send a single child out until I was sure they knew that it was all an illusion, that there were no ghosts, no evil shadows, just a scientific trick of the mind. Most of the class had recovered by the time they needed to leave for their next lesson. A couple still shaken, but I was satisfied that all they needed was a bit of a sit-down. I'd certainly knocked them down a peg or two. Amazingly, Jake even looked me right in the eye and said, "Nice one," before moving on. I was in a better mood than I'd been in all year. I told the head of year, and he let out a laugh so loud and appreciative I was sure half the surrounding classes had heard. God, I wish I'd been there, he chuckled. He then put his stern professional face on and said, "But you should really run these kinds of things past me first. If one of their parents complains." He trailed off, before looking at me again and letting his stern facade break into another wide, appreciative grin. I stayed on cloud 9 until later that evening. Everything was fine until the sun went down, and it started getting a bit dark. I could have sworn I saw another shadow dart hiding out of the corner of my eye. First time it happened, I was still full of bravado, thinking, I know what caused that. It must be the roadworks down the street. The pneumatic drill must be vibrating my windows just right. At that point, I actually believed myself. However, as the light continued to fade, the twilight carried on playing tricks on me. I kept seeing dancing in the shadows long after road crews had gone home. I tried just getting an early night, but I couldn't. As soon as I felt myself drifting off, I'd see more movement in the shadows. Hard as I tried, I kept seeing the darkness moving. They kept darting around. They darted towards, away, and around me. Sometimes they looked like they were just standing there. Other times they looked like they were ready to jump on me. My imagination was driving me wild. I couldn't take it anymore, so I bottled out. I turned on all the lights and I went on the internet. Unable to think of anything more constructive, I researched a bit more about Gavro's findings. Why didn't I do this before? Gavro's scientific studies had tapered away rather rapidly after his subsonic discovery, and from what I could see, they were replaced with increasingly erratic and less reliable conjecture about the nature and the power of the sounds and the shadows. Most of his academic companions deserted him as he got more and more unhinged. I remembered the power I felt manipulating the class, and I remembered having to tell myself that it was just an illusion. What if Gavro lost that grip on reality? And what if he kept pushing it until he forgot the science and believed his own pranks? I was hardly comforted when I found out that his final conclusion from his final published research paper, widely discredited by all who found it, was that the sound didn't make you see ghosts. The sound let you see ghosts that were already there. And they didn't appreciate being seen. And I couldn't sleep a wink. It didn't look like any of the class did either when I saw them the next day. Saggy-eyed, drowsy, and yawning, I asked them what was up. "I kept seeing shadows, sir," said one, and many murmured in agreement. Worse, though, was that one student hadn't turned up at all. Jake was absent. Not especially unusual. A lot of students played truant when given a chance, but something didn't sit right. I asked if any of the other students had heard anything from him. One girl timidly replied, "He texted me last night, sir. Said he couldn't sleep. Said he needed to find what was making the sound so he could turn it off. I just hoped he found it. I just hope he got some sleep. I hope we all would." Part 3. For good measure, I spent the remainder of the lesson going over the science behind my little illusion again, in order to try and allay their uncertainties and fears. It was almost funny. This lesson went even better than the previous one, as every student was held in a rapt state of attention. and the whole class clung onto my every word. They took notes, drew diagrams, asked deep and pertinent questions on and around the subject, and they even completed all of their group work with nary a ripple of disruption. I understood, of course, exactly what they were doing. They were trying their very best to understand what had happened to them yesterday, so that they could really try and put it behind them. I'd always seen scientists as brave pioneers into the unknown, but looking across their steadily brightening faces, I saw how science could just as easily be a comforting blanket, a rational barrier against the demons of the unknown. And by the end of the class, the horror of the previous day seemed to have well and truly faded and been replaced by a joking camaraderie. Kids who would have normally have been at each other's throats in group sessions were working without issue. They even seemed positively friendly with each other, in a way only a group who've experienced a shared hardship could be. It was a fantastic sight. My earlier doubts about whether I'd gone too far were still there, but to look at them working productively and peacefully with each other, it was difficult to be too concerned. Jake still played on my mind, though. I'm sure he was fine. He made truancy into an art form, but his texts about needing to turn off the sound in the middle of the night still made me nervous. But the lesson had one last shot for my nerves in store. It concluded without issue, and concerns for Jake aside, I genuinely thought that maybe I'd turned a corner with this class. I'd need to be far more careful if I was going to use it with any other classes in the future, though. I'd been completely unprepared for the intensity of the visions and the feelings of sheer terror. But it didn't seem to be anything that a bit of personal experimentation with the equipment couldn't refine in order to get the right level. And just looking at the quality of work that class had just produced, it was going to be easy to get the head of science to sign off on the experiment for further use. I was still running through these thoughts and contemplating what modifications to try next when, as the class were leaving, one girl asked to see me for a minute. In the now empty classroom, she stood, staring intently at her shoes and refusing to look me in the eye. "What is it, Amy?" She shifted her weight uncomfortably. "Sir, did..." She was having trouble formulating a question. Were the speakers on just then?" "When?" "During the lesson." "No." "Why?" The color drained from her face as she weakly answered, "Oh, nothing. It's nothing." She scuttled out, clearly needing to be anywhere but in that classroom. I wanted to call after her, chase her even, in order to clarify what she meant, but I was distracted by something skittering across the room out of the corner of my eye. I didn't get a clear look, and by the time I'd spun round to try and see, it had gone. I turned back to the corridor to shout after Amy, but she too had disappeared just as suddenly. Her question had disturbed me, and my mind returned to Jake. I used the morning break to contact the office to see if there was any word on him. Jake Tandy, Class G2. Any word from him or his parents as to where he is today?" I asked the office girl in charge of monitoring attendance. She was about to answer when a gray smudge darted across the doorway to my right and pulled my attention away. I was still staring intently at the door when, out of nowhere, Richard, my head of year, stuck his head into the room and asked to borrow me for a moment. He ushered me into his office and closed the door. "Jake Tandy was reported missing as of 9:30 a.m. this morning. What? By whom? His mother. When she noticed he wasn't in his bed this morning, she called round a couple of his girlfriends' houses to find out if he'd snuck out there in the night. None of them had seen him. And when she called us to find out if he was in school, we told her he wasn't here. Her next call, obviously, was to the police. Now, one of our students is officially missing. My mind was overwhelmed with questions. The playful grin that was on his face when I first told him of the demonstration was well and truly gone now, replaced by an unshifting expression of grave concern. The police found Jake's phone in his room. The final message sent details him going to find the source of a sound. They want to know what that means. Of course. Do they need a formal statement? I don't know. You can ask them for yourself. They want to talk to you as soon as we're finished. Now listen, and listen carefully. Now I'm sure I don't have to tell you how serious the consequences of this could be if Jake doesn't turn up quickly. This experiment you ran. Please tell me you ran some basic safety tests or ran a risk assessment. How could I have been so stupid? I didn't so much as do a test run before the lesson, let alone do something as sensible as documenting a full risk assessment, or investigate whether infrasound fell under COSHH regulations. My complete unforgivable incompetence must have been written across my face. Because before I could answer, Richard interrupted. You fucking fool. I had to focus all of my strength not to burst into tears right there in his office. My eyes were damp, but I maintained composure. Answer me this, and you had better answer truthfully, Richard continued. Do you have any cause for any form of concern for any of your other students? Amy, I uttered quietly, still staring at my hands to avoid revealing my increasingly watery eyes. What? I raised my head to meet his accusatory gaze. Amy Sunderland. She approached me after class today to ask... My heart stopped. Stood over each of Richard's shoulders were two towering, shadowy figures. Through the blur of my tears, I couldn't make out even basic features. I wasn't even sure they had any. All I could see were that they were definitely human-shaped. I was frozen with dread, and feeling of deep panic started welling up in my stomach. What? What did Amy ask? I rubbed my eyes dry in order to answer him. Once I'd cleared my sight, the figures were gone. I looked around, but there was nothing, and no one else there anymore. Answer me, damn it! She asked if I had the speakers on during today's lesson. I tried to ask her why, but she wouldn't answer me. And did you have them on? No. Right. Tell the police that. Tell them everything. I'll send them in. Richard stood up to leave and walked towards the door. I felt him stand behind me and place a reassuring hand on my shoulder. I couldn't believe how irresponsible I'd been. How reckless. I'd been so caught up in my own ambition that I hadn't even taken basic precautions, and now I was paying for it. I just hoped Jake was all right. I knew Richard was furious with me, but Feeling his protective hand on my shoulder meant maybe there was a way to fix it all. I heard Richard outside telling the officers to head in. Wait. Richard was outside. Then whose hand was... I spun round to see an empty room. I desperately tried to contain the panic now coursing through my veins. What was happening to me? It was just a fucking illusion. 2 officers entered the room. Hello, good morning. Thanks for talking with us. Now, tell me about, infrasound? Through the tension, I almost laughed. Where to begin? Part 4. I'd rarely seen police officers as young as the 2 opposite me. They lacked the authoritative confidence one would normally expect during questioning in a missing child case. The questions, too, were meandering and unfocused, as though the officers really didn't know what they were actually trying to achieve or elicit from me. And my guess was that they were junior dogs' buddies who had been lumped with the dull task of closing off a dead-end lead. And when a child goes missing, every lead needs to be chased, if only to protect the force against accusations of neglect if the search fails. But Jake was a troubled kid, and I knew he'd been caught dealing weed to other pupils. I imagined that the officers in charge of the case had a stack of leads that provided far more plausible explanations as to why a kid with links to the local low-level drug dealers might mysteriously go missing in the night. He wasn't going to waste his best officers chasing down a science teacher using strange noises to fill a room with ghosts. These officers were here on a glorified administrative mission. I could see their resentment in their eyes. But for their lack of experience and motivation, they were diligent nonetheless. They wanted more detail about the nature of infrasound and what it could mean in the context of Jake's text. So we discussed it in some detail. I delivered a mini science lesson in the nature of low-frequency wave energy, natural resonance, and how the retina could be fooled into seeing things that weren't there. Describing it was almost therapeutic, given everything that had just happened. As I'd felt my grasp on reality slipping, it was good to go over the simple, rational explanation for it to help me regain my grip. I answered all of their questions about Jake. Apparently all they found in Jake's home computer was a few articles about shadow people and ghosts, as well as a few research articles on unrelated medical procedures. And they wanted to know if the two could be linked, but I explained that Jake's mum was a nurse in the nearby hospital. If anyone was searching for methicillin-resistant staph, aureus treatments, or subcranial hematomas, or fecal emulsification techniques, then it was probably her. Shadow people in U-porn, though? That sounded more like Jake. Eventually, I had no further questions. Their theories were obviously not something I was supposed to be privy to. Their relative greenness as officers meant they let slip more than they should when exchanging tidbits. From what I could gather, they thought that my experiment had probably spooked him, leading to a sleepless night. In his insomnia, he probably tried to sneak out to visit a girlfriend, but had fallen afoul of one of his less amiable contacts en route. This was an implication that, even at 15, Jake already owed some serious people money. The officers had what they needed to close this lead. I was thanked for my help, and they left. Richard seemed visibly relieved when I explained to him everything we'd talked about. He'd clearly been driving himself crazy thinking the cops were investigating a case of neglect at the school and that he was going to be facing legal action over inappropriate experiments being conducted in the classroom. However, although the panic had faded, his anger had not. "Clean up this mess now. Talk to all your students from yesterday. Find out if any of them are still having problems and fix it. Make sure they know there's nothing to worry about. If I get so much of a report of a broken night's sleep from one of their parents, then you're finished." I sent messages out to all the students and asked them to come see me as soon as possible, as Richard had agreed to cover the rest of my day's classes. I interviewed them one by one, asking what they'd seen since the experiment. Most told stories about occasional glimpses of something in the dark. No one told me that he was so scared that he hadn't been able to do any of his homework. Nice try, I thought, but I kept my solemn face on. However, most had been able to nod off eventually, and few complained of anything further stretching into the daytime. In fact, when really pushed, most seemed to agree that anything they had seen was just their imagination going into overdrive. Secretly, I had my doubts as to how many of their visions truly were imaginary, but the calmer they were, the less they were affected. And if they truly did see fewer shadows, the less they believed. Then I was going to let them carry on and watch the problem solve itself. The end of the day came, and I looked over the register of the class to see who I'd managed to talk to. I'd managed to tick off everyone bar two: Jake and Amy. I hadn't seen Amy all day since she approached me after the lesson. I hurried to the administrative department to report it, but Amy had apparently been picked up by her father earlier that morning, claiming to be suffering from a massive headache. I breathed a sigh of relief. I could talk to her tomorrow, and hopefully another night's sleep would put the whole thing to bed. And with Amy safe at home, the day over, and Jake still nowhere to be found, I went back to my place. I poured myself a whiskey and stood at the window, watching the sun go down over the city horizon. It was normally a beautiful sight. This was one of the principal reasons I paid so much for this flat. But today, it held no such pleasure. The sun got lower, and I watched as the tall buildings' shadows elongated into the evening. There was something about the way the shadows were creeping across the streets and over the hedges and walls towards my windows that set my heart racing. Of course, it was just the angle of the sun, but for all the panic of the last 2 days, it was difficult to not feel an almost predatory feel to their approach. The way the shadows snaked through the trees and poured through my windows. The way the black imprints of the lampposts and power lines created long, grasping fingers that crawled up into my room. Soon, the whole city seemed to be cloaked in a dusky twilight, and every shadow seemed to writhe and pulsate. The wind blew the trees, and the shadows swayed on my walls, like a cobra waiting to strike. I downed the whiskey, and threw on all the lights for comfort, but there was no comfort to be had. The harsh, bright lights just turned my flat into a patchwork of shadows. And behind the couch, behind the TV, over the cupboards, and anywhere that bright central light couldn't reach was suddenly turned into a pool of darkness. A darkness that stared and watched and waited and mocked. A darkness that demanded to hold my gaze just so that it could gaze right back at me. I poured another whiskey, bringing it to my mouth, taking a deep swig, when through the distorted lens at the bottom of the glass, I saw a blurry, dark figure stood in front of me. I was paralyzed. The whiskey slopped against my teeth and burned my tongue, but I didn't dare swallow. I didn't dare move. I just watched as the shadowy figure towered, motionless, begging me to react. Then eternity passed in between the poundings of my heart. The vapor of the whiskey almost tickled my nostrils, and in that moment of lapsed concentration, the shadowy figure charged at me. I screamed and flailed, sending my glass shattering against the nearby wall. But then nothing. In the instant our gaze had broken, the figure was gone. I stood panting and breathless, my heart beating so loud I couldn't hear. I was sweating burnt adrenaline and shaking so hard my teeth were chattering. I brought my hand up, and grabbing a handful of hair, I collapsed backwards against the cupboard and slid to the floor. Not believing was the key to not seeing these things. Then I was doomed forever. Gavro was right. He must have been. These ghosts were already here. I just let them out. But what did they want? I don't know how long I sat there for. It felt like hours. Soon, though, I found my composure, and I found the courage to stand up. And I poured another whiskey. But the shadows were still there. In every alcove, nook, and cranny of furniture, there was another drape of shadow waiting to pounce. I had to get out of that place. Right then. I wandered the streets until I found an internet cafe that was open until late. Better still, they too had whiskey. I wasn't really paying attention to what I was doing, just blind, meaningless surfing of anything that came to mind. Given the evening I'd had, pictures of kittens were a central theme. However, through my aimless Googling, one particular results page came up. Result 1, as usual, was a wiki article. And I figured there was no harm in reading it in case anyone ever asked. So I clicked it. I felt my stomach lurch and my heart sink. I fumbled for my phone and dialed 999. I knew where Jake was. I just hoped I was in time. Part 5. And by the time I got to hospital, the police were already there. I should have known there was no way they'd let me see Jake, but the police were very eager to talk. My tongue couldn't keep pace with my brain, and the gargled mess of questions that I barraged the police with were barely coherent. An officer I hadn't met before raised an authoritative hand to silence me. "Please, sir, follow me. We have some further questions." "Is he all right?" "Sir, if you'd please, just follow me." I was ushered into a small room and sat down on a squeaky and uncomfortable chair. The officer took his place behind the desk. What the hell was this room? What kind of a hospital has an interrogation room? The officer was not one I recognized. He certainly wasn't with the two who questioned me earlier. He was older, comfortably so, a good 10 years without a doubt. He was also harder. and more experienced. His stony face revealed nothing of his intentions and how much he knew, and I imagined that, unlike the two rookies who questioned me earlier, I wasn't going to find a damn thing he didn't want me to know. "You're Jake's teacher, correct? The one who placed the 999 call?" "Yes, that's me. Is Jake all right?" "No, but he will survive." I couldn't tell whether to be relieved or not. The officer's poker face refused to let slip anything that could calm my fears for Jake. "But he's alive?" "Yes. Now, tell me, how did you know where to find Jake? How did you know he'd be here?" "It was a guess. Something your officers asked me about earlier." He held my gaze, revealing nothing, and taunting me into carrying on. "Your officers, that is, the infrasound." "Yes, this ghost noise of yours," he interrupted with the tone of a man sick of entertaining the idea that there was anything at play here other than an off-the-rails kid in trouble. However, there was the faintest flicker of doubt in his eyes, as though he'd seen something he couldn't reconcile with his foregone conclusion. "The infrasound interferes with your eye's lens. It makes you see things that aren't there. Terrible things. Jake's text about turning off the noise made me think that he was still seeing them, and that maybe that had something to do with his disappearance." The officer remained stoic. I had no doubt this was a man well versed in allowing criminals to hang themselves with their words, with nothing other than the blunt force of his silence. "Then this morning, your officers were talking to me about things that were in Jake's search history. Most of it was unsurprising given the nature of the vision and the nature of him being a 15-year-old boy. Then they mentioned some medical terms he'd also been searching for. At first I figured they were from his mum, as she's a nurse, and I didn't see any connection between them and the infrasonic visions." Still nothing. The officer was going to wait until I told him everything before he played his hand in return. Out of curiosity, I Googled the ones I hadn't heard of. The faintest twitch disturbed the officer's rigid gaze. Phacoemulsification. I finally spilt my finding. It's a form of eye surgery based on using ultrasound to break up cataracts. I saw Jake's logic straight away. I fucked up his eyes using infrasound. Maybe he thought he could fix them using ultrasound. I knew with his mum working here, he'd know the layout and maybe even have the means to gain access to the relevant wards. That was when I called you. Now please, tell me what happened to Jake." At this point, my mind was almost at breaking point. I just needed to know what was happening. The officer took his time to consider revealing what he knew, and eventually he leaned in close and said softly, "Jake Tandy blinded himself using the ultrasonic equipment in the ophthalmology lab. Now, I don't know whether that was what he intended to do, but that was a result." My jaw dropped. He directed 2 focused waves of ultrasound into each eye and destroyed the lens and retina. Nurses found him curled by the still-running machine, and when they tried to approach him, he lashed out at the sound of their approaching footsteps and screamed to be left alone. He calmed as soon as he heard their voices, and he was sobbing apologies for his outburst, saying, "I thought you were them." The nurses said he kept simply repeating, "They're gone. I can't see them. They're gone. I can't see them," as they took him to the intensive care. He was smiling. I was gonna be sick. I'm so sorry, Jake. I truly am. I never intended for any of this. Please believe me. Willie, is he... I stammered. As I said, he will live. There's no way to save his sight. And he will need extensive therapy. At this point, the officer leaned in closer. He had the same look of steely authority on his face that Richard had when he originally questioned me about the other affected pupils. He was mentally searching for something. Anything that could be used to pin this on me. But he was falling short. There were no regulations in place regarding infrasound, even in a concentrated experiment. So they couldn't even charge me with professional misconduct, let alone assault. I was free to go. Instead, he simply held my gaze and asked in a bullying tone, "Anything else to tell me?" There were hundreds of things. I wanted to tell him Jake was right. I wanted to tell him we were both being stalked by shadowy beings. I wanted to tell him my apartment was an inhospitable orgy of demonic head fuckery. But I didn't. At this point, I must have already looked insane enough without the truth making things worse. I simply whimpered, "No." Like a kicked puppy. In that case, you're free to go. But look, he said, softening his tone momentarily. If you think of anything else, here's my number. I was walking out of the hospital car park when a thought hit me like a brick. Amy. I failed Jake. And for that I could never forgive myself, but I could still save Amy. Oh, please let me be in time to save Amy. I immediately called the detective. Look, I'm still at the hospital. Can you meet me downstairs? I've thought of someone else you need to speak to, I told him. When the officer arrived in the cold, comfortably well-lit hospital reception area, I told him, you need to send someone to check on Amy Sunderland. She went home complaining of headaches, and she too complained of seeing the same shadows as Jake long after the experiment had finished. I don't see any reports of a missing Amy Sutherland. Sunderland? Look, she's not missing. She's at home. Her father collected her from school today. Listen, I appreciate your concern, but I can't send officers over to someone's house to see if a 15-year-old girl has recovered from a headache. Just please, send someone. I don't know her address, but her parents are Lydia and James Sunderland. I think she might be in danger. She reported exactly the same symptoms as Jake, just a few hours behind. If she's following the same path, then we might not have long enough to prevent the same thing happening again. Please! The officer fell silent. This wasn't the same authoritative silence he'd used to intimidate me during questioning. This was the genuine sound of indecision. He'd had a shitty night just because Jake had been found didn't mean that this case was solved. And he'd still had the shitstorm of having to discover how a missing 15-year-old boy had been able to get access to the hospital equipment and blind himself. He was weighing up whether he could justify sending officers to check on the girl given the crime scene at the hospital. My face must have swayed him. After all, the only reason Jake was found at all was because of my hunch. So he figured it was better safe than sorry. He pulled the walkie-talkie to his mouth. Send a car round to check on the house of Lydia and James Sunderland. Could you repeat the names? Crackled a male voice on the other end. Lydia Lydia and Jim Sunderland, parents of Amy Sunderland, he repeated.
Sir, I don't understand. You want another car sent there?
Came the voice, still seeking clarification. What do you mean, another?
2 cars already visited this evening, sir, accompanying the ambulance, in order to assess the scene and question the parents.
The professional facade the man had put on this morning was dying in front of me. His ashen face looked ready to crumble as the implication sunk in. He looked like he wanted to shoo me away in case I overheard important information. But he didn't. What happened? He quizzed the still nonplussed radio operator.
Sorry, sir. I thought you knew.
They don't allow phones in the hospital. I haven't been updated on anything for an hour or so. Tell me.
Sir, Amy Sunderland was found dead in her room this evening. She bled to death after clawing her own eyes out. Her parents had left her sleeping off a migraine to go to cinema and found her when they returned.
My world broke. I'd failed Amy. I failed Jake. I failed everyone. I don't even know what happened next. In mindless days, I drifted home. It was gone midnight by this point. Barely 48 hours since I'd found that damned article. 2 days ago, I'd been a self-pitying teacher with a tough class and a lack of balls. I now had the weight of Jake's sight and Amy's life crushing me. Through the aimless gaze that was my vision, I stumbled home. I didn't care. The shadows in the streets, and the bushes, in the alleys and between the cars seemed thicker, almost solid, tangible. They seemed to reach for me, to grasp for me, touch me, and grab me. I even felt fingers on my bare skin at times. Chilled scratches ran up my arms and down my neck. But I didn't care. When I got to my door, I opened it and looked into the shadowy flat. The darkness was alive now. I could feel it. At this point, I don't think even turning the light on could have dissipated the sea of writhing blackness that engulfed my home. It pulsed and swayed and seemed to breathe as I stared into it. It wasn't just a figure anymore. It was dozens of them, all dancing and mocking and taunting and begging me to join them. Inky black tendrils snaked out of the doorway and over the hallway walls like the branches of some foul tree growing out to produce some fouler fruit. Snakes of writhing black snuck across my floor towards my feet. Whatever I'd brought forth with my little science lesson wasn't going away and wasn't going to let me go. I still had another 30 kids to claim from my mistake. I could think of nothing else to sate them. So as the horrific fingers of whatever lived in those shadows continued to climb up my legs, I simply walked in and closed the door behind me. I didn't care. I'm sorry.
This is your captain speaking. I've just turned on the seatbelt sign. We're expecting a fair amount of turbulence coming up, so we ask that you please remain seated until the sign is turned off. We're on pace to land at Newark International Airport at 3:30 a.m., where the temperature is now a mild 65 degrees. Thank you for choosing American Airlines, and have a nice night. Norman Parker drained the watery dregs of his whiskey rocks and let the pebble-shaped remains of the ice cubes melt on his tongue. He checked that the man sitting next to him was still sleeping, then held out his hand to examine its steadiness. The Valium he had taken just refused to kick in. He should have prescribed himself a few more for the trip. He could have, of course, but he knew himself, so he hadn't. That's all right. There was always whiskey. A few more whiskeys, and the stubborn pill would have no choice but to dissolve, wherever the hell it was hiding in there. "Miss," he whispered, lifting a hand. He thought he was the only one awake on the plane by now. Through the dark approached the baggy-eyed stewardess. "Yes, sir," she yawned. "Another whiskey rocks, please." "Just a minute," and she walked off into the darkness. He took a long breath and exhaled through his nose. Then he took out a pack of Lucky Strikes and lit one and dropped the match in the ashtray. The ads said 9 out of 10 doctors chose Camel cigarettes. He wondered how many other doctors went through medical school only to find themselves on a plane every other day. Would have been an easier life if he had dropped out of that surgical program like he wanted to so many times. He'd have drank a lot less, too. "Here you are, doctor." The stewardess handed him his drink. He reached out to accept it, willing his hand steady. Still, the ice cubes rattled as he set it on his armrest. "There's no reward in any of it, honey," he said. "In the end, this drink is all there is." She smiled politely and went back to her seat, Parker examining her posterior as she went. Maybe the Valium had started to kick in after all. As promised, the turbulence began. The man sitting next to Parker stirred and snorted, but never woke up. Parker envied the guy. The wave of relaxation had started coming over him, but he was nowhere close to sleep. And no sooner did he lay back and close his eyes than a hideous, skull-shattering shriek shook him back to his senses. Parker jerked upright and turned to look over his shoulder, noticing others do the same. Murmurs of confusion filled the cabin. Then the shriek came again. Parker's instincts took over, the sense of immediacy instilled by years in the ER. The adrenaline burning away all residue of drug and drink as he got to his feet. "Oh my God, is there a doctor on board? Please, is there a doctor? Oh my God." But he was already on his way. The dimness revealed a figure sprawled over the armrest of an aisle seat, people standing around with their hands to their faces. The cabin lights illuminated, triggering gasps of horror and bringing Parker to a halt. Beneath the woman's dangling dark hair lay a widening pool of dark, wherein lay 2 gory lumps he identified immediately. Dangling their viscera, 2 eyeballs stared sightless down the aisle. "Clear out!" shouted Parker. "I'm a doctor. Give me space." The passengers spread out, shaking and whimpering. The man sitting next to the woman was backed against the window with his hands against his chest. Parker kneeled next to the woman and took hold of her wrist. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" No answer. He felt a pulse, weak but detectable. "Ma'am?" he repeated. Nothing. "Is she dead?" sobbed a woman. "I was just talking to her." "What happened?" said Parker. "I was sleeping. I heard her scream." He looked at the man in the window seat. His eyes were wide and terrified. "Sir?" "I was asleep. I don't know." Parker looked down at the sagging mound of dark hair, Slowly supporting her neck, he pushed the woman upright into her seat. 2 dark hollows staring back, eyelids lacerated and hanging loose. Parker's brain seemed to short-circuit, decades of experience reduced to worthless fragments. But this wasn't a patient. This was a horror. "Help her, doctor," the woman sobbed. "Please do something." Parker bit his lip, shook himself out of it. He was a surgeon, damn it. He'd seen worse. "Bring me all the medical supplies on board and land this plane." Whatever passengers weren't frozen with horror cleared away, rustling through bins for first aid supplies or running to the cockpit to spread the word. Parker gathered the woman into an embrace and, ignoring the blood and eyeballs, lowered her onto the floor and lifted her legs onto a pile of carry-on bags. From nearby seats, he grabbed blankets and piled them on top of her. Then he straddled the woman, gently tilted her head back, and felt for a pulse in her carotid artery. Her heart was still beating, but weakly. Again his eyes landed on her face. Again his brain seemed to freeze. How could this have happened? The man in the seat next to her hadn't moved, only sat stunned, with eyes like 2 hard-boiled eggs. "Tell me," Parker hissed. The man didn't answer, only continued to stare dumbfounded at the bloody mess on the floor. Unable to think, unable to help himself, Parker followed the man's gaze. The eyes were moving, turning in their pool of gore, the optic nerves winding around like little feet in a puddle of mud. Then the eyes were looking at him. Uncommonly strong hands rose up from below and seized his shirt. Parker shrieked. He stared down into the eyeless face. "I'm a doctor. I'm trying to—" "Shut up, Parker," she said. The voice wasn't one of a woman, but some blood-soaked tone from oblivion. "You call yourself a surgeon? You couldn't hold a scalpel steady if your life depended on it, Parker. You drunken sot." Parker's mouth quivered. "I'm trying to help." "You can't even help yourself, Parker." "Please let go of me. Let go." "Let go of yourself, Parker." The woman's fingers found his belly, caressing at first, then winding and grinding like the blades of a food processor. The fingernails bit into the flesh, tore skin from muscle, muscle from viscera, so fast he couldn't react. The hands were inside of him, unplugging his bowels, making balloon animals from his guts. He pushed against the woman's chest, but she was up to her elbows in him. Gore cascading down her elbows, falling in clumps onto her sundress. His intestines emptied out like pig slop. The eyes turned away. The plane was empty. "It won't be long, Parker." Norman Parker woke with a gasp. His shirt was soaked with sweat. "Are you all right, sir?" The flight attendant was pushing by a garbage cart and had stopped to look at him. Yes, I'm fine." "Do you need anything?" "Maybe a club soda? Thank you." She nodded and walked by. Parker took a napkin and wiped his forehead. It wasn't unusual to have dreams of drinking. He'd had plenty over the last decade since he had quit, but never a dream like this. "Bad dream, Doc?" asked the man next to him. "Must be nerves," Parker said. The napkin he had used to wipe his forehead was already soaked. He put it in the empty plastic cup on his tray. "I never sleep well on planes." "Me neither. Hope you can rest up before the big surgery." Parker checked his watch. "The surgery is scheduled for Friday morning, so I'll have another night to rest up. Anyway, being tired is no obstacle. I've been tired since medical school. Come to think of it, I don't remember working any way but tired." "Well, I'll try not to think about that the next time I have to have surgery." "Nah, don't worry. We can do it in our sleep. Hell, during residency, that's mostly what we were doing." "Now there's a comforting thought," the man said. At the hotel, Parker lay stretched out on top of the comforter with his shoes on, the dream still fairly fresh in his mind. It hadn't faded away like they usually do. Instead, it stood in his mind like some fog that refused to dissipate. "I don't think I've had a dream so vivid since quitting the drink," he thought, and even those had been fleeting enough. This one felt more like an actual experience. He lifted his arm and checked his watch. He extended his fingers and let his hand hang there a minute. steady as a rock. 60 years old, dry for 10. Good for maybe 10 more years if he kept his business in order. Or, more importantly, kept his hand steady. By sunrise, it was obvious he wasn't getting any more sleep. He made coffee and had a bowl of cereal for breakfast and went down to the lobby to get a newspaper. He sat reading, having his second cup of coffee, when snapshots of the dream filtered into his consciousness. He set down his cup and folded the paper. After a few minutes, he got up and headed back to his room. He sat at the desk and opened his laptop and brought up the chart from the hospital's database. Rose Marie Friday, 37 years of age, odd-shaped growth on the pineal region of the brain, deemed by most to be inoperable. Need a rush job? Deemed inoperable? Call Dr. Second Opinion Parker. If you can afford the surgery, first-class airfare, and have the strength to sign a lengthy waiver, you just might have a shot after all. Ms. Friday, he read, suffered persistent headaches, sought medical treatment for sleep-related particularities. Particularities? The pineal gland is responsible for melatonin. Maybe the tumor was affecting production of the hormone. Only speculation. Hardly mattered at this juncture. On a whim, Parker put the pineal gland in his search engine and brought up the surgical database he frequented. A little refresher never hurt, even for a brain surgeon. And it had been a long time since he had been that deep into a brain. Or into his own, for that matter. The pineal gland, the theological third eye to the New Age nuts of the world. Parker clicked casually between whatever articles seemed pertinent, but little more seemed known about the pineal gland since Parker's school days. From its secluded alcove in the center of the brain, the full scope of its purpose remained a mystery. Plenty of doohickey about it. He had heard a fair amount of it in college himself. Some was from an old professor of his, Dr. Van Nessen. As far back as the ancient Greeks, he had explained, the pineal gland was thought to be a mystical eye to see the unseen, a portal to some hidden dimension where higher awareness is accessible to those in the know. Van Nessen had explained the gland is thought to generate a powerful chemical that may be responsible for the phenomenon of one's life passing before one's eyes. He spoke the terms may be and could be quite a bit for a brain sciences course, earning him the nickname Van Maybe among the students. A wave of exhaustion came over Parker. He closed his computer and lay back on the bed. What sort of perverted dance was his own pineal gland doing while he had that awful dream on the plane? He had been drinking and smoking. There were ashtrays on the plane. What year was it anyway? Somehow he knew it was 1976. 1976, a medical student, performing well, but wild as any young guy. Parker and his classmates sneaking into the medical lab, lifting samples of pharmaceutical-grade cocaine, drinking in the resident quarters at Holy Cross Hospital. Parker and the others arguing at 3 a.m. over who's the least drunk to take the call for the patient with a headache. What a way to ruin a Friday night. As usual, Parker took the call, drunk as anyone, only the best of the group at concealing it. He composed himself and knocked gently before opening the door. Inside, a woman sat on the edge of the examination table, bare legs and feet dangling from a paper rope. Long black hair, dark eyes. "I'm Dr. Parker," he said. "What seems to be the problem?" "I'm Amy," the woman said. "It's a headache. I've had it for days. It's so bad, I can't even sleep. Do you think it's something serious?" "Any history of headaches, migraines?" Parker felt a pang of annoyance at the woman for disturbing his evening. A headache? She should try a goddamn medical residency. Parker's whole life was a headache at this point. "I've had migraines in the past. At least that's what I think they were. Never anything like this, though." Parker sat on the stool and took the clipboard from the counter. The nurse had measured the woman's blood pressure at 130/75. No problem there. He shined his pen light into the woman's eyes and watched her pupils shrink against the light, dilate again once he shut it off. A little slower than usual, perhaps, but nothing to cause alarm. "I think I smell alcohol," the woman said. "Disinfectant," Parker assured her, trying his best to conceal his annoyance. It's a migraine. Have you been taking painkillers? Aspirin? I tried a couple aspirin, but they didn't help. Try a couple more, he said. With caffeine. A cup of coffee or tea will do it. The combination makes the aspirin work better. You don't need much. A little dab will do you. The Brill Cream slogan was usually good for a chuckle, but the girl was too nervous to laugh. You don't think it's anything serious? Nah, don't worry, Amy. You have a good night, all right? Feel better. Okay, the woman said. Parker hurried back to the residence quarters to rejoin his friends. He didn't give the woman another thought. Not until a couple months later, when he recognized her name on a clipboard hung outside a door on the oncology ward. When he saw the diagnosis on the chart, a black hole suddenly formed in his stomach. He snatched the clipboard from the hook and flipped through the pages. A vicious, amorphous tumor had wormed its way through the woman's brains, consuming her optic nerves in the process. Inoperable for certain. There wasn't a surgeon alive who'd be willing to attempt to remove this one, to scrape the sprawling, intricate mass away from the delicate nerves and blood vessels it had woven its way through. You might loosen the grip of those cancerous tendrils with repeated doses of radiation, but Parker knew it was far too late to beat it completely into submission. The woman was doomed. There was just no way around it. She was doomed, Parker muttered to himself. She had already been doomed when he had seen her 2 months earlier. It had already been too late to help her, hadn't it? Parker checked the file to see if there was any indication she had come to see him that drunken Friday night. There wasn't. Parker hadn't charted it. He had been too drunk to bother. The girl hadn't bothered spilling the beans either. At this point, she was probably too sick to remember. Parker hung the clipboard back where he had found it and checked the hall to make sure no one had seen him reading it. He took a deep breath and composed himself, brushing aside a pang of guilt. There was no way he could have known the headache was anything serious. Still, he couldn't help looking through the little window on the door as he started to walk away. There she was, same dark hair, same dark eyes. Sightless eyes, he knew. There was no way she could see him with her optic nerves devoured by cancer. Still, the eyes were open, and they were staring right at him. He had never forgotten those eyes, not completely anyway. He had managed to push them pretty far back in his mind, but obviously, they were still there somewhere. It didn't take a psychologist to make the connection between the memory and the horrible dream he had had on the plane. But why now? And how had it been so incredibly real? Parker lay in bed at 12:30 p.m. watching trashy afternoon TV. Still exhausted, but no sleep was forthcoming. Not until tonight. His mind kept wandering back to college, that nutty professor, Dr. Van Nessen. He wondered if he might still be around, still living in the area. He typed his name into the computer and the search turned up 2 results. Unsure exactly why he was doing it, Parker picked up the phone and dialed. After several rings, a man answered. Hello? Parker was silent for a moment. Dr. Van Nessen? Speaking. Who is this? Norman Parker. I doubt you remember me. I used to be a student of yours, 30-some years ago. Norman Parker. Do you happen to remember the subject of your final paper? Parker thought about it for a moment. No, I'm sorry, drawing a blank. Really, Norman? I thought your analysis of the dopamine-serotonin feedback loop was rather well done. Wow, Parker said. Your memory's uncanny, Dr. Van Nessen. Call me Harold, Norman. If a man can't take his ego to the great beyond, he sure as hell can't bring his doctorate. And believe me, I'm checked in and waiting at the gate. That sounds grim, chuckled Parker. Nah, said Van Nessen. Just a little senior humor. So, how have you fared since taking my magnificent class? I'm a neurosurgeon. Just flew in to perform a surgery at St. Pete's. That's phenomenal, Parker. I'm so glad to hear you fulfilled your potential. He sounded genuinely pleased for him, and that incredible memory. Parker wasn't sure why he'd called the guy, but he was glad that he did. So, to what do I owe the pleasure of your call? Van Nessen asked. It's a pinealectomy, Parker said. I was looking over the charts, thought of your class, wanted to see how you were doing. I'm so happy you remembered me, Van Nessen said. Maybe we could get together while you're in town. Dinner, perhaps? Parker had been wondering about dinner. I'm free tonight, he said. Any place in mind? There's a great Italian place nearby. Just tell the cab driver to take you to Salatati's. He'll know just where it is. Sounds good to me. How's about 7? Perfect. It'll be good to have some company. Marie passed on near 10 years ago. It's been pretty quiet since then. Sorry to hear that. That's all right, Norman. I'm off to meet her soon. So I'll see you at 7? Salatati's at 7. I'll see you there, Harold. 2. Salatati's, 7:30 p.m. So, what's your secret, Harold? Which cliched answer do you prefer? Good living, organic food? Van Nessen took a sip of Merlot, admired it, put it down. 4 ounces of wine with dinner, but only 4. Maybe that's my secret. Was never any help to me, said Parker. That why the seltzer? 10 years ago it would have been gin and tonic, with a Valium appetizer. Good for you, Norman. At least you set it down when you had to. Yesterday has no bearing on today. Thank you, Parker said. Tell me, have you maintained your enthusiasm for the pineal gland? Absolutely, Van Nessen said. Parker went into his jacket pocket and took out the charts. Van Nessen simultaneously took the papers and unfolded his reading glasses. Pineoblastoma. No biopsy performed? Tomorrow's surgery, Parker said. Deemed inoperable. That's why I'm here. They call me the Parker Express. The Parker Express. I like that. It's all I do nowadays. The travel is a pain, but I only work once a month or so, sometimes less. Short order surgery? Well, that's one way to put it, if you want to compare me to a fry cook. Van Nessen grinned. Expedited, I should have said. Parker chuckled. I've got the most comprehensive waiver of any fry cook you've ever seen. Many of my cases are surgeries no one else will attempt. Interesting, Van Nessen said. More often than not, it's a matter of pulling the trigger. I don't always save the patient, but I always save time. Give me an example, Van Nessen said. My last case worked out. A man's son had a slow-growing tumor around the cervical region of his spine. They had biopsied it by then, a very rare cancer. His doctors wanted to shrink the tumor with chemotherapy before having a go at it. The father came to me with ants in his pants and his wallet wide open. His son was worried about losing his hair, missing a season of baseball. You get the idea. So I arrived in Atlanta in 8 hours, took care of the paperwork, and I'm in surgery an hour later. Removing that tumor was like stripping a live wire. He smiled with satisfaction. But I got all of it, every last bit. The patient is doing well? His doctor recommended radiation for good measure. I doubt they went through with it. All in all, I saved the patient his hair, but I cost his father quite a bit of money. So it goes. Van Nessen nodded. And your surgery tomorrow, have you performed a pinealectomy before? A few, Parker said. All nasal. This time I'll go in between the occipital lobe and cerebellum. Have a look at the MRI there. Van Nessen flipped back to the image and nodded, studying it. Parker watched the reverse of the image in the candlelight through the page. Such a strange shape for a tumor of that region. The waiter brought their orders and they returned to small talk for a while as they ate. Eventually, Van Nessen picked back up the MRI. The idea of it seems so strange to me, being without a pineal gland altogether. Do you still believe all that stuff about the third eye? Sure I do, said Van Nessen. Even though most of us never really use it, it seems strange to have it removed altogether. Like a door permanently shut, you know? I'm not exactly the spiritual type, Parker said. But what made you think of me? Asked Van Nessen. An old professor, never touched a scalpel. How did you think I could help you with this? Parker took a long breath and exhaled through his nose. I had this dream on the plane, the most vivid, horrible nightmare I've ever had. Maybe it got me thinking about my own pineal gland. Van Nessen nodded. You believe it was more than just a dream? A vision, perhaps? A premonition of things to come? I don't believe anything, Parker said. A pause. Parker lifted his right hand an inch or two off the table, checking it for steadiness. He didn't mean for Van Nessen to notice, but he appeared to notice. Do you want to tell me about the dream? I don't know, Parker said. Does it really matter? Well, that's up to you. If you want to talk, I'll listen. A contemplative pause. Parker drummed his fingers on the table. You know what it is, Harold? It's just that I don't think up things like that. I'm good with my hands. I can slice the cancer from around an artery. I can clip an aneurysm with one arm tied behind my back. But I'll be damned if I can write a poem, paint a picture, or even dream up a dream. I don't have a creative bone in my body, Harold. This dream, it doesn't feel as much as like I had it, as if it happened to me. Parker looked at his hands, realized he was squeezing 2 handfuls of the tablecloth. He breathed deeply and let it go. Van Nessen was regarding him concernedly. You're only as sick as your biggest secret, they say. You think I'm sick, Harold? It's only an expression, Norman. I haven't had a drink or drug in 10 years, 11 this May. Maybe I was sick once, but not anymore. I believe you, Norman. He raised his glass. Parker took a breath, smoothed his tie, and raised his own. They clinked their glasses together. To the Parker Express, said Dr. Van Nessen. 3. Parker walked into St. Peter's Hospital at 10 a.m., checked in with security, and took the elevator to the 4th floor oncology ward. The head nurse greeted him without enthusiasm. Obviously, she must have heard of him. Room 13, doctor. Left down the hallway, last door on the right. Parker thanked her and headed down the hallway. Surgery was scheduled for noon. They'd be taking her down to prep her shortly. For the time being, it was customary to introduce himself and discuss what was to come. A few pleasantries, that was all. Nothing to convey any certainty of the outcome. She knew herself that was impossible. Parker offered hope, but never any certainty. Parker peeked through the window and knocked gently. He entered. Ms. Friday? The woman's face was obscured beneath a mop of black hair. Long black hair. He approached quietly. Are you awake, Ms. Friday? No response. Gently, Parker reached out and brushed aside a lock of hair. He froze. The woman's eyes were partially closed, only the bloodshot whites visible from under the strained lids, the malevolent force of the tumor having not only rendered the woman blind, but pushed the eyeballs themselves halfway out of her skull. Ms. Friday? You don't think it's anything serious, doctor? Parker swallowed. He pushed the old memory aside. What had her name been? Anne? Amy? It didn't matter. It was over 20 years ago at this point. Yesterday had no bearing on today. Van Nessen had given him that much advice. The woman on the bed suddenly reached out and took Parker's hand. He nearly pulled away in shock, but he caught himself. He felt a bead of sweat trickling down his forehead. Dr. Parker, Ms. Friday said, the voice a cancerous growl. Is it you? Parker fumbled for a reply. I'll do my very best to help you, Ms. Friday, I promise. You can't even help yourself, Parker. What? Thank you so much, doctor. Parker muttered something reassuring in reply and hurried out of the room, positive he had misheard that last comment. It was that dream, that damned dream, still lingering around in his mind. You're a brain surgeon, goddammit, get a hold of yourself. But it was worse than that. His hands were shaking, and that was no dream. That was real life. 2 hours to surgery, and now his hands were shaking. What's happening to me? Parker stood still for a moment, just breathing deeply and trying to calm himself. It wasn't long before that forbidden thought wormed its way into his consciousness. The one he had had to resist countless times the past decade, would need to resist countless times more in the future. But today was an exception, a medical exception no less. He had an important job to do, and to do that job, he needed one thing above all others: steady hands. Parker opened his eyes, a bolt of adrenaline-laced motivation. He returned to Ms. Friday's room and went back inside. Parker picked the phone up off the wall and hit a few buttons. A moment later, he said quietly, "This is Dr. Parker, room 13, oncology. Please send up a Valium, 10 milligrams. Yes, and please hurry. Friday is the name? Rose Marie. Yes, thank you." He hung up, a twinge of anxiety through a cloud of egoic satisfaction. It was medicine, that was all. He was a doctor, wasn't he? Who would know better than him? The woman was mercifully silent as he waited for the nurse to arrive with the Valium, likely sleeping. The hair was back over her face, a comfort for them both. He stood like a specter in the corner of the room, the woman in the bed like an ill omen. A knock at the door. Parker opened it immediately. A pharmacy clerk stood with a paper cup, accusing him with her eyes. "Thank you," Parker said, snatching the cup and closing the door. Hesitating for a moment, he finally upended the cup and chewed down the pill. The familiar bitter tang he remembered from so long ago seemed to say, "Where have you been, Parker? We're still the same. We've been here all along. We've been waiting for you." He walked out of the room, his hands still shaking, but the burst of dopamine settling his nerves. He walked the halls. He sat on a bench for a while and waited for the delicious wave of serenity to wash over him. That familiar feeling, the one he wasn't allowed to have anymore. But today, this was his exception. He checked his watch, 10:30 a.m., 1.5 hours to surgery, 1 hour to start getting prepared, 1 hour to shake these incessant creeps off of his hands and out of his brain. Settle down, Parker. It's just your goddamn imagination. So what if she looks a little like that woman in the dream? What is it? The hair? How many women have long black hair? Plenty, Parker supposed. Hell, so did that girl from back in his residency with the brain tumor. The one he sent home with a couple aspirin, only to return with... The squeak of a gurney shook Parker from his reverie. 2 aides rounded the corner down the hall, making their way to the elevator. As the gurney disappeared inside, Rose Marie Friday turned her head to face him. She couldn't see him, not with her optic nerves gobbled up with cancer. Still, he shuddered. His hands, his arms, his brains.
"You couldn't hold a scalpel steady if your life depended on it, Parker."
Get a hold of yourself, Parker. It was only a dream. Only a dream. 4. 12 p.m. All eyes on Parker as he walked into the operating room. His nervous system felt like a static-charged rug. 10 milligrams of Valium, and he thought he should have taken 20. He didn't feel a goddamn thing. All he felt was terror. Relax, Parker. The nurses, the anesthesiologist, they were talking to him, but all he heard was the white noise of his circulatory system coursing through his ears. When is this goddamn pill gonna kick in? Next Friday? Next month? Supine before him was the shaved skull of Rose Marie. On the sterile tray next to him, the bone saw he'd be using to remove a section of her skull. Like opening a door to hell. Underneath lay all the darkness of the human condition. No different in his own head, he supposed, or anyone else's for that matter. But this was his stomping ground. This was what he did. He could handle this. Everyone was looking at Parker now. No doubt they could sense he was stalling. A nurse was standing at his side trying to hand him a scalpel. He hadn't even noticed her standing there. The clock said 12:05. "Dr. Parker," she said, "is everything all right?" "Everything is fine," Parker said. "How does she look?" "Terrible," one of the aides joked. "She's stable," the anesthesiologist said. "Good," Parker said. He raised a hand to accept the scalpel. The black hole in his stomach sucking mercilessly. He turned to the patient, placed one hand on her forehead, rechecked the x-ray, looked again at the woman's freshly shaved scalp. He paused. Time around him seemed to freeze. It was very, very quiet. Are you all right, Doctor? The hand holding the scalpel was shaking. Shaking.
You call yourself a surgeon? You couldn't hold a scalpel steady if your life depended on it, Parker. You drunken sot.
I'm trying to help you, you stupid bitch, Parker bellowed. Silence in the operating room. The nurses, the aides, the anesthesiologist. They all stood stunned, watching him wide-eyed from behind their masks. Parker set the scalpel back in the tray, backed away a few steps. Stay where you are, everybody. I won't be long. I'll be right back. You understand? He didn't wait for a reply. He turned and burst through the double doors. There was no way around this. He knew what he needed. It always helped those stubborn pills to do their job. A little grease to help them go down. That was all. Just a little drink, a little dab. A little dab'll do ya. I know how this seems, Parker. He was talking to himself as he walked down the hall, but somehow it seemed wholly appropriate. But there's a big difference between a relapse and a medical exception. Any doctor would agree. 9 out of 10 doctors prefer Camel cigarettes. 10 out of 10 doctors agree. A little dab'll do ya. He passed by 2 nurses in the hall. They slowed down and watched him as he went. He paid no attention. The absurdity wasn't lost on him. It just didn't matter. Help her, doctor. Please do something. I am doing something. What does it look like I'm doing? You think this job is easy? 1976 and a doctor can't get a goddamn drink? Parker pushed open the door to the supply room. A little dab, that's all. Doctor's orders. The door closed behind Parker and he laughed out loud. He didn't know why he did it, but it felt good, so he did it again. So what'll it be, says the bartender. Parker sifted through the shelves until he found what he was looking for. He knew as well as any talented surgeon that this wasn't top-shelf stuff, but hey, it wasn't the nicest bar he'd ever been to either. Besides, all he needed was a little dab, just to take the edge off, you know? Just enough to get that damned pill to kick in, so he could get a hold of himself and do his job. So he could get back to that operating room and fix that lady as good as new. Like she just walked out of the showroom. He could roll back the mileage to 1976, before everything got fucked up. He found what he was looking for and twisted off the top of the bottle and tilted it back into his mouth. He swallowed. He sputtered and coughed. Drank again, and again. He checked his watch, 12:13 p.m. He leaned with his back against a shelf of folded towels, feeling the warmth expand in his stomach. It wouldn't be long now. Not long now. I won't be long, Parker. Epilogue. In unusual news out of Newark, New Jersey, notable neurosurgeon Norman Parker was found dead in a supply closet in St. Peter's Hospital. The cause of death? Poisoning, due to consumption of isopropyl alcohol, better known as rubbing alcohol. Hospital staffers remain shocked and confused by the incident, which apparently took place during a surgery which Dr. Parker himself was supposed to be performing. Stay tuned for updates as they come in, and let us take this opportunity to remind our listeners to secure all drawers and cabinets containing potentially hazardous chemicals to keep them out of the hands of children and brain surgeons. As always, thanks for listening.
With their black clothing and hats jeweled by the combined moistures of drizzle and fog, the huddled mourners looked beautiful through the zoom lens. Katie panned the camera across the throng to better admire the perfection of the scene. Long overcoats, sleek shirts, heels stabbing into the grass, banded Homburgs, even a scattering of spiderwebbed veils, all spoke of the wealth and power gathered round the open grave, like Hollywood's idea of the perfect somber funeral. The fog swirled, gravestones leaned in the foreground, and the limp branches of a willow provided a sway of green backdrop so that the mourners were like black opals lying against a jeweler's felt. The camera clicked and froze the image forever. Excellent. A fine picture, all would agree, but not good enough for Katie right then. Not when she could sense perfection hovering within reach. She waited for the final detail to slot into place and create the shot, the one guaranteed to accompany that month's feature article. All that stood, literally, between Katie and her big breakthrough was a thin man in what looked to be an ill-fitting suit, his sloping shoulders narrow but just wide enough to obscure the star of the show and many others. The recently widowed Felicity Royal. Her wide hat haloed the man's head in black, but her face was hidden. "Come on, move," she urged him through gritted teeth, shifting as the damp grass started to soak through her jeans. Like a suddenly flourished handkerchief, the priest stepped out of the throng and stood looking into the grave to the left of the shot, his bright white robes contrasting perfectly with the gloominess of the falling light. He started to speak. Katie could hear the drone, but not make out the words from her prone position behind a manicured hedge, and the mourners' heads bowed as one. "Shit, this is it, move your ass," she hissed at the thin man. A woman's head dropped onto the shoulder of her companion. "Come on, for God's sake." The priest's hands clasped a blood-red Bible to his chest. All she could think was, not quite the one, not quite the one, not quite the one. Never before had she wished anyone dead, truly and sincerely and horribly dead, but she wished a whole range of grisly fates on that thin man right then. Each passing second, each click of the camera meant the chance, this glorious, possibly once-in-a-career chance, was slipping away, all thanks to some skinny bastard in an overpriced suit. Katie hissed through her nostrils as the priest's words ended. Several of the throng shifted slightly, about to lift their heads. She screamed silently behind the shrubbery, wrestling with her fury to keep the camera still. Then it happened. The skinny man stepped to his right, just one step, to pat someone on the elbow, and suddenly, the widow herself, Felicity Royal, a mascara-streaked crimson lipstick version of the Felicity Royal who had graced televisions the country over for years, glanced up at the overcast heavens, her ashen face emerging like a beacon from under her hat, whilst those around her still gloomed at the sodden ground. The chief editor beamed and thumped his desk.
Now that
He boomed, jabbing a finger at the laptop screen in front of him.
is 15 carats solid gold.
Katie smiled the modest smile she had practiced in the mirror a couple of hours ago when the summons to the office of Peep had come through. The fact that the magazine had been in touch mere minutes after she emailed the photo confirmed the feeling that had tingled through her since she had captured the perfect shot at the cemetery. This was it. Peep's chief editor spun the laptop round to her, and Katie's modesty crumbled in the glow of her photograph on the screen. A shadowy, somber masterpiece etched out in pin-sharp high resolution.
Own up right now, Catherine.
The editor almost shouted, and Katie flinched, the grin dying on her face.
Come on, you bloody paid those people to pose, didn't you? Couldn't be better if you'd told them where to stand.
She breathed in relief and adjusted her skirt over her knees. Just in the right place at the right time, I suppose. The editor sat back, pulling the laptop back towards him, eyes on the screen, and laughed.
You make that sound like luck. That's the trick of your job, isn't it?
Katie watched his eyes flicker around the image, seeing how they constantly came back to the pale, upward-turned face of Felicity Royal, and knew with a flush of heat that thousands would soon do the same thing when they saw the front cover of Peep on the shelves in a month's time.
Bloody hell. The composition is perfect.
The editor continued in a more hushed voice, as if seeing the photograph for the first time.
The mourners, the trees, the gravestones.
He paused for a breath.
And her. Beautiful and sad and lost, all at the same time. The punters are going to lap it up.
Looking at the back of the laptop's lid, Katie remembered the widow in that one moment and the raw, naked pain on Felicity Royal's face that had never been seen on a television screen. A pain that the public was soon to hungrily drink in. For the first time, she felt the faintest needle prick of guilt. But then the editor lowered the screen, and the talk turned to money and royalties and an extended contract. The meeting ended quickly, with promises of being in touch soon and a brisk handshake.
Oh, Catherine.
The editor stopped her before she closed the door.
Unfortunately, there's no such thing as perfection, you know.
She frowned in puzzlement.
We'll have to airbrush the weirdo out. He spoils the mood a bit. No big deal. Speak to you on Tuesday.
Katie, still frowning, clicked the door shut with hot hands and hurried to the lift, already reaching for the tablet in her bag. Weirdo. She shakily opened the photo file and peered at the image she thought she knew so well. What had the editor said? He spoils the mood a bit. He. Katie scanned the mourners, seeing them all anew. They were actually people now, not glamorous funeral mannequins. Their faces contorted or slackened or rigid with genuine grief. She picked out the men, all holding onto female hands or arms or shoulders. All except one. A thin man, the one who had moved just in time, stood turned to the side, and he stood alone. His face was lined and angular in profile, his eye hidden in the shadow of a deep socket that made him appear to be in his 50s at least, in a black suit that, now Katie looked more closely, wasn't particularly expensive. His gaunt face bowed to the open grave and hands clasped. He looked every inch the mourner, apart from the fact that he was grinning. The wrought iron cemetery gates loomed grandly against a big sky of cloudless blue, inviting Katie inside onto a path that wound amongst the grass and gravestones. The sun made her squint, but curling leaves pooling in the lengthening shadows of tree trunks signaled the final days of summer, and she zipped up her jacket. In the distance, across the spiky, stony sweep of headstones, a high fence of iron spears and broad trees marked the section of the cemetery that was closed off to the ordinary members of the public. Further along the fence, there was a slight gap where she had squeezed through a few days ago. The private section was where Felicity Royal's husband was buried, where she had taken what promised to be a career-defining photograph, where a thin man had stood amongst a grieving crowd and smiled. The hollow indented eye socket, the laughter lines spiderwebbing from one corner of his eye, the long crease from cheek to clean-shaven chin, the pale, pale lips pursed in amusement, all magnified on Katie's laptop screen, had haunted her ever since. She couldn't get over the wrongness of his expression. Again and again she had peered at the faces of all the mourners, trying to spot one of them sharing the thin man's smile. She unconsciously capitalized him now, trying to see anything that might have sparked his humor. Their expressions varied slightly, but all were contorted in sadness. Perhaps the man was remembering some joke he'd shared with the deceased, or a happy memory. Somehow that didn't explain it. At first, the sneaky nature of the smile had convinced her the thin man was pleased that Mr. Royal was dead, and she began to contrive all sorts of plots and crimes that he might be guilty of. He was a jealous brother, a scheming business partner, a murderous family physician. She soon dismissed such soap opera thinking, but could not shift the conviction that he was guilty of something other than a severe lack of empathy or tact. A breath of wind edged with autumn ruffled Katie's hair, and she looked up to see that she had reached the end of the public section of the cemetery. The gate at the path's end was only slightly smaller than the main entrance, but padlocked, with opening times posted in a glass case and directions pointing to a porter's lodge. Here, the public gravestones were older, their edges rounded with names faded or mossed over. The air was damper and darker here, the sun screened by a thick green canopy of trees overhanging the private fence. But it was quiet and restful. Spurts of unkempt grass wavered in another gust as if waving goodbye to warmer seasons. The graves and verges nearer the main entrance were cleaner and trimmed and ordered, but Katie liked the sense of freedom and privacy here. She supposed that this distant corner would be pretty spooky at night, but in the September sunshine it was...
beautiful.
someone said. Katie yelped and spun around.
Isn't it?
The thin man asked, standing nearby, staring at her. Yes, Katie answered reflexively, taking a small step back, hand fluttering to her chest before she could stop it. Pale lips pursing, the thin man smiled. A smile that she knew so well, and the sight of it so close to her made her feel dizzy and unreal. He turned away and bent over to peer at a crumbling gravestone.
There's a bench there.
It took Katie a moment to focus on what he had just said.
Take a seat,
he said, rubbing some moss away from an inscription. His voice was soft and oddly comforting, like a granddad's voice. She looked around, saw the bench behind her and sat down, frowning at the tremble in her thighs. Get a grip of yourself, girl. Bloody hell. Look at the age of him. You could knock him over with one hand. Up close, Katie saw that he was a lot older than she had first thought. Perhaps in his 80s, judging by the veins showing through the papery skin on his knuckly hands. They didn't so much as quiver as he cleaned the headstone, however, and he moved with slow certainty, not even bending his knees to reach down. White hair swept back, covered his head, and rested like strands of cotton on his collar. The thin man's suit had once been expensive, she could tell by the cut, but had the stiff shininess of unwashed black worn too often. His trousers ended just above grey socks, adding to the slight air of shabbiness that hung about him. In her photograph, he had looked a lot more smart, a lot sharper. The suit wasn't right on him, she decided. It hung awkwardly about him, creasing and folding in the wrong places. He'd probably had it for years and had shrunk like old men do, age withering them into shadowy versions of their former selves. He was certainly thin. The padded suit shoulders drooped significantly, but he didn't seem fragile in the slightest.
That's better,
he said, flicking away the last bit of moss and standing upright. Katie squinted. He sort of rolled smoothly upright rather than jerkily straightening, as she expected. He saw her watching and placed a hand on his lower back while stretching extravagantly, his smile crooking into a grimace.
I should take it easy. These old bones grumble at me more and more each day.
Bloody charlatan. You're more limber than me, Katie thought, but smiled sympathetically. The thin man gestured to the bench, smiling again.
Mind if I take the weight off these achy legs?
Trying not to hesitate, Katie slid over and placed her handbag between them. She crossed her legs and pretended not to look as he sighed loudly down onto his seat. Again, despite the outward show of fragility, he seemed to flow into position. The bench didn't even creak as he settled his weight into place and neatly folded his hands in his lap. He too gazed out at the gravestone stretching out before them.
As I was saying, it's beautiful, isn't it?
All in that mellow granddad voice of his. It didn't seem reassuring now, though, right by her like someone speaking in an advert or narrating in a film. The thin man didn't speak loudly, but his words rumbled in her teeth and bones, like the bass was turned up too loudly. Also, old and thin as he was, he seemed to fill the space next to Katie, and she had to fight the urge to shift away from him. She nodded neutrally, wondering what about this old guy was raising the hairs on her arms.
I love this place at this time of year.
He paused and inhaled deeply through his nostrils.
A meeting of borders and the edges of things.
An arm swept out dramatically.
Here we are in a place where the living visit the dead. At a time when things stop growing and get ready to die away.
Leaning forward so that he intruded into Katie's field of vision, he continued.
That grave there, for example.
She turned her head to see him pointing at the headstone he had been cleaning earlier.
Edna Bradbury found out she had cancer when she was 34, knew it was terminal, and made the most of her remaining time. Last 6 months of her life were the best, they said. To paraphrase the old line, the flame that burns half as long burns twice as bright. As I say, borders and edges. I remember her funeral well. Good turnout, big blue sky, like today. She was well loved.
Katie's unease was growing and her scalp started to prickle with sweat. She blurted out, "So, do you come here often then?" And winced. "Nice one, Katie girl. Now you're using one of the oldest chat-up lines in the book on an old man. Go get your walking stick, hotshot, you've pulled." The thin man didn't laugh or smile as she expected.
Oh, yes.
He let the hiss drift out into silence.
But then, you know I do. You've seen me here before, haven't you?
Caught off guard, she flushed and started to sputter something, anything. He had held up a long-fingered hand to stop her and laughed heartily. Like a television Santa, she thought wildly. Ho, 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 merry funeral.
Don't worry yourself, Katie. I'm not angry.
She sat bolt upright at the mention of her name. What is this?
Turns out we're a lot alike. Let me explain.
How does he know my name? As the thin man reached into a pocket inside his blazer, Katie, thoughts and questions whirling, looked around the cemetery and realized this section was empty. It seemed no one, well, nobody except the weirdo all-stars on this bench, came to this forgotten corner. Feeling confused and foolish and somehow cornered, her eyes traced along the path to the distant far entrance gates. Why don't I just get up and walk away? She wondered, and felt her thigh muscles tensing to rise. The magazine the thin man placed across her legs stopped her as surely as if he had just dropped a granite gravestone onto them. On the front, corpse-like and blaring close-up, the anguished face of Felicity Royal tilted upwards as if appealing to the word peep, burned blockily across the top in lurid tabloid red. Felicity's slender neck drew the reader's eyes down to the bold white capitals of the headline, Royal Agony. The thin man leaned in close, his scentless breath tickling Katie's cheek.
Now that is simply going to leap off the shelves, don't you think?
He sat back, and Katie could feel his eyes on her.
Good work, Katie.
She felt relieved when sudden anger extinguished her fear. She turned on him. What the fuck is this? Are you some kind of sick stalker or something? The thin man merely smiled at her. Do you work for the Royals? Some kind of private detective? She waved the magazine in his face and almost shouted. This is next month's edition. It's not even out yet. How did you get this? Maddeningly, the thin man merely straightened his tie and replied calmly.
Let's just call it a special edition. Advance copy. I don't see why you're so upset. It's a splendid piece of work. Why don't you calm down and turn to page 3?
What? You listen to me, you...
It's a beautiful photograph.
He interrupted smoothly.
But then you already know that, of course. Go on, enjoy the fruits of your labours.
You work at Peep, don't you? Or you know someone there. Someone who got you a copy. Katie tried to hold on to her anger and the strength it had given her, but felt it slipping away, and she didn't resist when the thin man slipped the magazine from her hands. When she looked up, he was holding open a double-page spread. The headline ran, The Pain and Grief of a Star, above her photograph. Undeniably beautiful, but now awful in that beauty. A very public window into a private moment. Katie imagined people uttering mock sympathy as they bought it along with their cigarettes and chocolate, women chatting about the tragedy as they waited for their hair to dry in salons, social media sites discussing what the widow was wearing and whether her jewelry complemented her dress and shoes. Then someone else would die or become pregnant or get married or divorced or just fall out of a taxi drunk, and Felicity Royal's endless pain would be binned and forgotten. Katie felt sick and claustrophobic, and leaned back, trying to see the sky through the maze of branches arching over the bench. Patches and flickers of blue only increased the sense of suffocation, the trees hemming her in with her shame. The thin man stood smoothly, unrolling from the bench, tugging his suit into shape over his frame. He folded Peep and tucked it into his jacket pocket.
I have been to so many funerals in here. And over there, of course.
He gestured to the gate leading to the private section.
But the memories always fade.
He gestured at the grave he had been standing over earlier.
Like inscriptions on headstones.
Katie tried to think of something to say, to ask how he knew about her, but couldn't. The thin man sniffled the air.
Yes. Summer fades and autumn waits for its turn. And here we both are. Borders. See?
He began to stroll away. "Wait! It's not right!" Katie shouted as a thought suddenly struck her. She jumped up from the bench as the thin man stopped. "The photograph! It's the wrong one. I mean, you're in it. Keith, the editor. He said you'd be airbrushed out."
Yes, and I will be. I don't crave attention. I like to go about my business quietly.
You got hold of a copy weeks before publication, with a non-edited picture. What the hell is your business? And that wasn't a rough edition you showed me. That looked like a finished product. The thin man half turned to show her the profile and grin she knew so well.
Like I said, special edition.
Katie merely stared as he glided away, his suit dark and lopsided against the white gravel of the path, sauntering like a man half his age. Still, she watched as he went through the gates, turned left and disappeared. What the hell? She breathed and slumped back onto the bench. Her brain whirled as she tried to rationalize it all. So who was the thin man then? Convinced he had some connection to Peep, she rose, intending to drive down to the office right then and demand some answers. But the gravestone the thin man had taken such an interest in earlier caught her eye. Edna something, the cancer victim. He said he attended the funeral on a day like today. She hesitated. Go on then, you morbid cow. Go have a look, then get the hell out of this place. Perhaps she was a relation of his, she reasoned, and there'll be some clue to who he is. Just what kind of clue she didn't know, however, and supposed she was just trying to justify her grim nosiness. As she expected, despite the thin man's efforts, the inscription was mostly illegible. The lettering eroded. She looked around and saw that most of the graves were unkempt and unloved here in this older part of the cemetery. She frowned, suspicion darkening her thoughts. Peering close, she made out what must have been part of a name. Adbury. That's right, Edna Bradbury. Weather and moss had claimed most of the other writing, but when she licked her thumb and rubbed at indentations near the bottom, Katie revealed a date chiseled neatly into the granite. September 1st, 1897. Nice blue sky that day, was there, Mr. Thin Man? Bullshit. She stood up with satisfaction. I knew you were full of it, bloody old creep. Katie set off down the path with renewed purpose, and was actually smiling as she emerged from the tree shade into bright, clear sunshine. Of course, I bet he saw my name as photographer in the magazine. As to how he had known she would be at the cemetery, she still didn't know, but supposed vaguely that he would expect her to revisit the scene of the crime, as her mind put it without thinking, and returning guilt watered down her satisfaction. How he knew she'd be here today, well, it could have been sheer luck, or to hell with that for now. Just get to the office. She nodded, convinced, and clanged the iron gate shut behind her. That bloody editor or someone has got some talking to do. Despite the pinch of chill in the air, borders see, Katie wound the window down to let some welcome breeze into the car. She hadn't decided what to do once she knew who the thin man was, but for now knowing would be enough. She took a left off the main road onto a residential street to avoid the lights at the crossroad junction, and immediately regretted the decision when the car she had been following suddenly stopped. Bloody idiot! I nearly went into the back of you! She shouted out of the window, then immediately pulled her head back in when she saw what the reason was. She barked out a hard laugh. What? Unbelievable. A funeral procession of a hearse and dozens of mourners slowly made their way up the street. What is it about funerals at the moment? She thought, but didn't speak out loud, for a deep, delicate quiet enveloped the scene, with only the thrumming of the hearse's engine and the occasional scrape of a shoe breaking what would have been utter silence. The lights of the car in front went out, and Katie turned her own engine off as a mark of respect. Local residents peered out of bedroom windows or came to their gates to watch, and Katie remembered herself before an automatic frown of disapproval formed on her face. Your days of being a hypocrite have long gone, I'm afraid. Better get used to a lifetime of not judging. The hearse, long and gleaming, glided past, the driver's face impassive beneath his peaked hat. Katie closed her window as the coffin, polished and new behind flawless glass, drew level with her car. White carnations spelled out, Grandma. Then the mourners drifted by, obviously a family, with adults and children huddled together, heads bowed. Many others followed a few steps behind, couples linking arms, men with awkward hands clasped behind their backs. The sense of loss ached in the air as the procession snaked towards the cemetery. Katie, not wanting to look but not knowing what else to do, thought about what the thin man had said about funerals being where death and life meet for a while. She glanced up at the cold, clear sky, especially at a time like this, at the edge of another season. The last of the mourners drifted by, but none looked her way. Car engines starting up broke the spell, and Katie sat up straight, took in a big breath, and turned the key in the ignition. The car in front pulled away, and she turned the wheel to follow, glancing in the rearview mirror as she set off. What? The lopsided suit, creased in the wrong places, the white hair combed back. Him! She almost stalled, the car juddering, recovered and looked again. At the back of the procession, appearing for all of the world like he belonged there, the thin man sauntered after the hearse. He didn't look her way. Bastard! She almost screamed, overcome with a fury she couldn't fully explain. His words came back to her.
I have been to so many funerals.
But how did he get here that fast? He did leave before me. Must have known about the funeral, driven here, then slipped into the procession. She remembered a small girl in a dark grey dress, a grandchild probably, sucking her thumb, bewildered, carried by a weeping woman. She banged the steering wheel. Sick bastard! You and me, we are nothing alike, you parasite! All Katie could think about was getting to Peep's office and finding out just who the thin man was once and for all. She sped away and quickly caught the car in front. How about I photograph you again, thin man? Expose you in your own centre-page spread. Wipe that bloody smile off your face. Teeth gritted, she eased off the accelerator, cursing the slowness of the traffic. In the near distance, a traffic light showed amber, and she urged the car in front to get through before it changed to red. She realized that in her anger, she had blindly turned back onto the main road, and was at the crossroads junction she had wanted to avoid in the first place. Damn it! This is the day from hell. Just let me get to that office. With maddening inevitability, the traffic light flipped to red just after the car in front squeezed through. Katie slowed, then cursed loudly and planted her foot on the accelerator. She just had enough time to register the protesting growl of her engine and the blaring of a horn before a bus loomed like a titan and smashed into her. The world boomed, jerked madly, then whirled as Katie's car crumpled in the bus's jaws, scraped sideways, then flipped onto its roof. In seconds, the scream of the bus's brakes and the squealing grind of metal on tarmac tightened into a single thin, high note of pain. Katie moaned as the upside-down world grayed around her before the sharp, coppery stink of blood snapped her back. The seatbelt felt like a band of fire across her chest, and she panicked when she could only manage to inhale a faint whistle of breath. Dimly, she realized the pain needling through her body stopped at her waist. She bent her head up, trying to look at her legs, but they were lost in a tangle of metal, and her neck exploded in agony. Her arms, sleeved in blood, dangled down against the roof. and she started to cry when she couldn't make the move. She started to grey out again. The sound of her name was like a lifeline reaching out to her through the gathering darkness, and blarily she caught onto it, trying to hold on.
Come on, Katie. Open your eyes.
Her eyelids, feeling raw and fleshy and so heavy, slowly lifted open, and she squinted.
Open your eyes.
The voice came from the passenger's window, where a figure kneeled, silhouetted against the sharp glitter of daylight. The brightness hurt her eyes, but Katie strained to see, clinging to the voice.
Come on, Katie.
He knows my name, she thought dreamily. She blinked, willing herself to focus. Details started to sharpen out of the blur of light, her reeling brain trying to reassemble the upside-down elements into an image. White hair, a lopsided dark suit, a smile she knew so well. No, please, no. She tried to turn away, but metal bit into bone and skin, and she nearly passed out again.
Don't you worry, Katie,
he said as she began to sob.
I will be there.
Chilling tales for dark